Tonight, we're diving into the real history of Halloween, and it turns out your innocent tradition of dressing kids as superheroes and begging neighbors for candy has a direct lineage to people hiding from child-stealing fairies, ritually murdering failed kings, and carving grotesque faces into turnips to ward off the eternally damned. This is history with all the details they skipped in textbooks, the terrifying, the macabre, and yes, the occasionally blood-soaked. If you enjoy learning about how ancient death cults evolved into billion-dollar costume industries without falling asleep, hit that like button. Subscribe if you want more deep dives into history's darkest corners and the strange ways humanity has tried to cope with existential terror. And let me know in the comments, what's the creepiest Halloween tradition you've encountered? And did you have any idea it might be 3,000 years old? Alright, let's start with a question. Ever wondered why we do any of this? Every October 31st, millions of people worldwide participate in what is objectively bizarre behavior. We hollow out vegetables and light them on fire. We send children door to door in disguises to demand food from strangers. We pay money to be chased through dark buildings by people wielding fake chainsaws. We watch films about masked killers and then dress our kids as those killers. And we call this fun. But here's the thing about Halloween that makes it fundamentally different from every other holiday on the calendar. Christmas celebrates births. Easter celebrates resurrection. Thanksgiving celebrates harvest and gratitude. Halloween celebrates death itself. It is the one night modern society explicitly grants permission to openly contemplate chaos, mortality, and the supernatural. And it's been doing that in one form or another for 3,000 years. This sugar-coated holiday we know today, with its fun-sized Snickers bars and inflatable lawn decorations, hides a legitimately terrifying history. The deepest roots of our spooky season lie not in candy corn, but in the grim, firelit landscapes of Iron Age Europe. We're talking about a time when winter wasn't an inconvenience requiring a heavier coat. Winter was a potential death sentence. And the transition into that season, that required serious spiritual preparation. We begin with Samhain, pronounced Cillian. This ancient Celtic festival marked what the Celts called summer's end. But it was far more significant than just changing seasons. Samhain was the Celtic New Year, the moment when the year truly died. The harvest was complete. The livestock had been brought in from the fields. The long, brutal winter stretched ahead. This was the beginning of what Celtic culture called the dark half of the year, a 6-month period of cold, darkness, scarcity, and death. Picture this. You're living in Iron Age Ireland. No central heating, no grocery stores, no hospitals. Your survival through the next 6 months depends entirely on the food you've managed to store and the livestock you've managed to keep alive. One bad harvest, you starve. One severe winter, half your village dies. The stakes weren't abstract. They were life and death every single year. But the physical dangers weren't even the worst part. The Celts believed that on the night of Samhain, something catastrophic happened to the fabric of reality itself. The boundary between the mortal realm and the other world, the realm of the dead, of spirits, of supernatural forces, didn't just weaken. It dissolved completely. The veil between worlds thinned to nothing, allowing spirits, demons, and malevolent entities to walk freely among the living. Now, you might be thinking this sounds kinda sweet. dead ancestors coming back for a visit, a supernatural family reunion. Wrong. This wasn't a Hallmark movie. The entities crossing that veil weren't all benevolent grandparents checking in on the family. The other world was home to dangerous, unpredictable forces that could curse your land, destroy your crops, sicken your livestock, and this is where it gets truly dark, steal your children. The primary terror centered on beings called the Aosa, often translated as fairies or people of the mounds. And before you picture Tinkerbell, let me be clear. These were not cute, sparkly creatures granting wishes. The Aosa were territorial, vengeful, and extremely dangerous. They lived in fairy mounds, which archaeological evidence reveals were often ancient burial sites, and they were possessive of their world to a homicidal degree. Offend the Aosid even accidentally, and the consequences were severe. Trespass on their land, curse. Speak ill of them, curse. Look at them wrong, probably also a curse. They could render your fields barren, ensuring your family starved through winter. They could sicken your animals, destroying your only source of protein and labor. And most gruesomely, they could kidnap the livings, specifically targeting young boys, leaving families destroyed and communities terrorized. This wasn't folklore as entertainment. This was folklore as survival manual. So what did the Celts do about this annual supernatural invasion? They developed elaborate rituals centered entirely on making it through the night alive. They lit enormous bonfires. We're not talking about a cozy campfire. These were massive communal blazes designed to drive away darkness and evil spirits while serving as centers for fire rituals and fortune-telling. The fires were protection, prayer, and community gathering, all in one. They made offerings to appease the spirits crossing over. Food, drink, whatever might convince malevolent entities to leave you alone. And critically, this is the direct ancestor of your kid's Spider-Man costume they wore disguises. The historical documentation is clear on this point. The initial motivation for wearing costumes during Samhain was not entertainment. It wasn't remembrance. It wasn't cultural expression. It was practical, immediate necessity. These were chilling forms of spiritual camouflage designed to ward off or hide from malevolent entities like the AOC or sick. Think about that for a moment. Your Halloween costume, that thing you spend $40 on at Spirit Halloween's, started as survival gear, spiritual body armor. If you couldn't fight the supernatural threats, maybe you could blend in with them. Wear animal skins. Cover your face with soot or ash. Look dead yourself, and maybe death would pass you by. Samhain marked the societal shift into a period of chaos, and the extreme rituals performed were viewed by the community as attempts to reimpose order. This wasn't just religious devotion. These were deeply socio-political acts necessary to ensure the community's successful, safe transition into the brutal winter. The culture's survival depended on these rituals. And sometimes, though, this is where the evidence gets truly grim. Those rituals included blood. Archaeological discoveries from the bogs of Ireland and Britain have revealed something that transformed Samhain from spooky folklore into documented horror. Preserved in oxygen-depleted peat, scientists have found bodies, lots of them, and these people did not die peacefully. The bog borders show clear evidence of ritualized violence. Multiple traumas inflicted in specific patterns, blunt force to the head, strangulation, throats cut, a methodology archaeologists call triple death, because apparently one murder wasn't ceremonial enough. The prevailing theory, the ritual murder of kings. If a king's reign coincided with disaster crop failure, plague, invasion, he was considered to have failed the gods, and the cosmic solution was his execution. Not a trial, not exile. Ritual sacrifice to restore balance. His body would then be deposited in the bogs, those liminal spaces between land and water, life and death. This is the world Halloween came from. Not cute, not quaint, legitimately terrifying. But here's what makes this holiday absolutely fascinating from a historical perspective. Halloween survived. Most pagan festivals didn't make it past Christianization. Most ancient death cults got stamped out by theological reform or social progress. But Halloween adapted. When Rome conquered Celtic lands, they didn't eradicate Samhain. They merged it with their own festivals honoring the dead. When Christianity spread across Europe, the Church didn't destroy the holiday. They repurposed it, strategically overlaying All Saints' Day and All Souls' Day directly on top of Samhain's timeline. Medieval peasants transformed the spiritual terror into economic opportunity, going door to door, trading prayers for soul cakes. Victorian spiritualists turned deathly fear into parlor entertainment with seances and ghost stories. American cities facing Halloween vandalism so severe it threatened to destroy the holiday entirely invented supervised trick-or-treating as a behavior modification program. The modern entertainment industry transformed ancient terror into a multi-billion-dollar haunted attraction industry. 3,000 years. One holiday. Constant adaptation. This is the story we're about to tell. The complete, unvarnished history of Halloween. From ritual sacrifice and haunting bark bodies of ancient Ireland, through medieval Europe's obsession with death and decay, through the strange birth of modern trick-or-treating, to the rise of slasher films and the global commercialization of fear itself. We're going to trace the terrifying line from Sane Wind to your neighborhood's inflatable yard decorations. From the AOSC to Michael Myers, from spiritual survival to recreational terror. From carved turnips illuminating the damned to pumpkins mass-produced by grocery chains. The history of this holiday reveals a fundamental, persistent human need. The cyclical attempt to manage the existential terror of death and chaos. Every era creates its own mechanisms for confronting mortality. The Celts used fire and blood. Medieval Christians used prayer and morbid art. Modern Americans use candy and Hollywood villains. The methods change. The underlying anxiety that stays the same. By the time we're done, you're going to see your local Halloween store very differently. You're going to understand that when you carve a jack-o'-lantern, you're participating in a tradition designed to ward off the eternally damned. When your kids wear costumes, they're unknowingly continuing a practice that once meant the difference between life and death. When you pay admission to a haunted house, you're purchasing a sanitized, commercialized version of the spiritual terror that kept entire civilizations awake at night. Halloween endures because, whether through ritual fire, theological warnings, morbid medieval art, civic behavior modification, or high-tech gore, it allows humanity to acknowledge the darkness without succumbing to it. It gives us permission just one night a year to stare directly at death, chaos, and the supernatural, and then go back to normal life the next morning. So tonight, we confront the haunting, Pagan roots of All Hallows Eve. We examine the bloodline of fear that connects ancient human sacrifice to your kid's candy haul. We explore how humanity has spent 3 millennia trying to cope with mortality, and how that coping mechanism evolved into the second largest commercial holiday in America. Prepare yourself. This gets dark before it gets commercial. Let's begin where Halloween began, the dying light of the Celtic New Year, when the veil thinned and survival was never guaranteed. The Celtic calendar didn't mess around with arbitrary divisions. The year was split into 2 halves, and the dividing line between them was absolute. There was the light, half-Beltane through summer, when crops grew and livestock thrived and survival felt achievable. And then there was the dark half-Samhain through winter, when everything died or tried very hard to kill you. Samhain, pronounced Suin, literally means summer's end. But that translation doesn't capture the weight of what that ending actually meant. This wasn't the modern inconvenience of needing to scrape frost off your windshield. This was the beginning of a 6-month period when your primary daily concern was not freezing or starving to death. The harvest was finished. Whatever food you'd managed to grow and preserve was all you had. There were no supply chains, no grocery stores, no backup plans. You made it through winter, or you didn't. So when the Celts marked Samhain as their new year, they weren't being poetic. They were acknowledging a fundamental reset of reality. The old year died, the new year began. And with that transition came danger, both physical and supernatural. Because here's where Celtic spirituality gets genuinely unsettling. The Celts didn't view the boundary between the living world and the other world as a permanent barrier. They saw it as a membrane, thin in some places, thick in others, but never impenetrable. And on Samhain, that membrane dissolved completely. The veil between the mortal realm and the realm of the dead effectively ceased to exist for one night. Picture the cosmology here. The other world wasn't some distant heaven or underground hell. It existed parallel to the mortal world, occupying the same space, separated only by this supernatural boundary. It was home to the dead ancestors who'd passed on, but also to entities that had never been human, spirits, demons, forces that predated human civilization entirely. And when the veil thinned on Samhain, all of them could cross over. Now, some of those crossings were welcome. Dead ancestors returning to visit their families, that could be comforting. Communities would set places at the table for deceased relatives, leave out food and drink, light candles to guide them home. There was a sentimental aspect to Samhain, a recognition that death didn't sever family bonds completely. But that's not what kept people up at night. The real terror of Samhain centered on everything else that could cross that veil. Malevolent spirits, chaotic forces, entities that viewed humans as prey, not family. The night wasn't just about welcoming dead grandma back for a visit. It was about surviving an annual supernatural invasion by things that actively wanted to harm you. And at the top of that threat list, the Aoas. The name translates roughly to people of the mounds, or folk of the mounds, and they're often described in English as fairies. But if you're picturing Disney's Tinkerbell, or sparkly beings granting wishes, erase that immediately. The Aoas were not cute. They were not benevolent. They were territorial, powerful, and extremely dangerous. The Aoas were believed to reside in fairy mounds, Ithan hills, that dotted the Irish and Scottish landscape. Archaeological evidence has revealed that many of these mounds were actually ancient burial sites, places where generations of the dead had been interred. So the Eowasa weren't just supernatural entities living in random hills. They were supernatural entities living in graveyards that should tell you something about their nature. These beings were intensely possessive of their territory and quick to retaliate against any perceived slight. And the definition of slight was broad and terrifying. Trespass on their land without permission. That's a cursing. Fail to show proper respect when passing their mounds. Cursing. Speak ill of them, even accidentally. You guessed it, cursing. Build your house too close to their territory. Hope you enjoy crop failure and livestock death, because that's what you just signed up for. The consequences of offending the AOSC were severe and specific. They could curse your land, rendering it infertile. Your fields would produce nothing. Your family would starve. They could sicken your animals, your cows, your sheep, your horses, destroying your only sources of food, clothing, and labor. In an agricultural society where survival depended entirely on your ability to grow food and raise livestock, these weren't minor inconveniences. These were existential threats. But the most horrifying capability attributed to the AOSC was their tendency to kidnap the living. Specifically, they targeted children, young boys in particular, according to the folklore. The stories describe the AOSS stealing children away to the otherworld, leaving families destroyed and communities terrorized. Sometimes they'd leave a changeling in the child's place, a sickly, strange creature that looked like the stolen child, but behaved entirely wrong. Other times, the child would simply vanish, taken through the thinned veil on Samhain night, never to return. Think about what that fear meant in practical terms. You're a Celtic parent. You've just finished the harvest. Winter is coming. Your food stores are limited. Your children are your future labor force, your legacy, your reason for surviving it all. And now you have to face a night when supernatural entities known for stealing children can walk freely through your village. Next time you complain about helicopter parenting, remember that Celtic parents were dealing with actual predatory fairies. This was an abstract spiritual concern. This was immediate, visceral terror that shaped community behavior. On Samhain night, families stayed inside. Doors were barred, windows were covered, children were kept close and watched constantly. You did not go wandering around after dark on Samhain unless you had a death wish or a very good reason. But staying inside wasn't enough. You needed active protection. That's where the elaborate Samhain rituals come in. These weren't optional religious observances. These were survival protocols. The most visible element of Samhain was the bonfires. And we need to be clear about the scale here. These weren't backyard fire pits where you roast marshmallows. Celtic Samhain bonfires were enormous communal braziers, huge structures of wood that could be seen for miles, generating enough heat and light to drive back the darkness, both literal and supernatural. The fires served multiple functions simultaneously. On the practical level, they provided light and warmth as winter approached. On the spiritual level, they were believed to drive away evil spirits and malevolent entities. Fire was purifying. Fire was protective. Fire created a boundary that supernatural threats supposedly couldn't cross. Communities would gather around these bonfires for fire rituals, ceremonies whose specific details have been lost to history but clearly involved some combination of offerings, prayers, and appeals to whatever gods or forces might provide protection through the long winter ahead. The fires were also centers for divination practices. People would cast nuts or stones into the flames and interpret the results to predict the future. Whether they'd survived winter, whether marriages would be successful, whether the next harvest would be sufficient. The symbolism was clear. Light against darkness, warmth against cold, community against chaos, but bonfires alone weren't sufficient protection. You needed personal defense as well. Enter the costumes. This is the direct ancestor of your kid's Elsa outfit, and the origin is far darker than Disney. The historical documentation is unambiguous. The initial motivation for wearing disguises during Samhain was not entertainment, not cultural expression, not remembrance of the dead. It was immediate, practical necessity, a form of spiritual camouflage. The logic was brutal in its simplicity. If you couldn't fight the supernatural entities crossing the veil, maybe you could hide from them. Or better yet, maybe you could blend in with them. Make yourself look already dead, already claimed, already one of them, and perhaps they'd pass you by. So people wore animal skins and hides, transforming their human silhouettes into something bestial and unfamiliar. They covered their faces with soot or ash, making their skin look like death itself. Some wore masks or veils to obscure their features entirely. The goal wasn't to look pretty or creative. The goal was to look wrong inhuman, supernatural, already claimed by the other world. Think about the psychology there. You're so terrified of being targeted by malevolent spirits that your survival strategy is to make yourself look like something that's already being killed or claimed. That's the level of fear we're talking about. Halloween costumes began as witness protection for your soul. The disguises served another function as well. If you were out after dark on Samhain, traveling between houses to check on neighbors, or participating in community rituals, the costume identified you to other living humans, while theoretically hiding you from supernatural threats. It was a uniform of survival. These weren't the only protective measures. Communities made offerings to appease the spirits crossing over. Food would be left outside homespread. Milk, portions of the harvest stars, bribes or tribute to any passing entities. The message was clear. Here's something for you. Now please leave us alone. Think of it as a protection racket, but the racketeers were incorporeal and could curse your crops. Some traditions involve leaving windows or doors slightly open to allow ancestral spirits to enter and receive hospitality, while simultaneously using various charms, herbs, or iron implements to keep the malevolent entities out. Iron, in particular, was believed to be anathema to the AOSC and other fairy folk. It disrupted their magic, caused them pain, created barriers they couldn't cross. So iron horseshoes, iron nails, iron tools would be placed at thresholds and entry points. All of this, the bonfires, the costumes, the offerings, the iron. The staying inside was society's attempt to impose order on chaos. Because that's what Samhain fundamentally represented, the moment when cosmic order broke down and chaos reigned. The Celtic worldview wasn't dualistic in the Christian sense of good versus evil. It was more about order versus chaos, structure versus entropy. The light half of the year represented order-predictable seasons, growing crops, thriving life. The dark half represented chaos, predictable weather, scarcity, death, and the transition point between them, Samhain, was when chaos temporarily won. The rituals weren't about defeating chaos permanently. That was impossible. The dark half would come every year. Winter would always arrive. Death would always be part of life. The rituals were about managing chaos, containing it, surviving it long enough to reach the next light heart. This is crucial context for understanding the more violent aspects of Samhain that archaeological evidence suggests existed. We're not just talking about spiritual beliefs here. We're talking about a society that viewed these rituals as necessary infrastructure for survival. If you believed, truly deeply believed, that cosmic chaos would destroy your community without intervention, how far would you go to reimpose order? Would you sacrifice animals? Absolutely. The evidence is clear that livestock were ritually slaughtered during Samhain, both as offerings to the gods and spirits and as practical preparation for winter. You couldn't feed all your animals through the lean months, so you'd slaughter some in the fall, preserve the meat, and offer portions to the supernatural powers you hoped would protect what remained. But would you go further? Would you sacrifice humans? The question is controversial among historians. Ancient Celtic culture didn't leave written records, so we're piecing together their practices from Roman accounts, which are biased and potentially exaggerated. Later, Irish and Welsh mythology, which was written down centuries after Christianization, and archaeological evidence, which is open to interpretation. But there's one category of archaeological evidence that's genuinely hard to dismiss: the bog bodies. In the oxygen-depleted environments of peat bogs across Ireland, Britain, and Northern Europe, hundreds of remarkably preserved human remains have been discovered. These aren't skeletal remains. These are bodies with skin, hair, internal organ soft tissue, preserved for millennia by the unique chemistry of the bogs. And when scientists examine these bodies, the cause of death is often disturbingly clear. Many bog bodies show evidence of extreme ritualized violence. Not the chaotic injuries of combat or accident, but methodical, ceremonial trauma. Blows to the head delivered with specific force, ligature marks on necks indicating strangulation, throats precisely cut. Some bodies display all three, what archaeologists call triple death or threefold death, a pattern of multiple killing methods applied to a single victim in what appears to be ritualistic sequence. The most famous Irish examples include Old Crogan Man and Clonachaven Man, both discovered in 2003. Old Crogan Man was in his 20s when he died sometime between 362 and 175 BC, right in the Iron Age period when Samhain was being observed. His arms showed defensive wounds. His nipples had been cut, a specific injury that some researchers link to Celtic kingship rituals, as sucking a king's nipples was apparently a gesture of submission to authority. He'd been stabbed in the ribs, then decapitated, then placed in the bog. Clonachaven Man was younger, perhaps late teens or early 20s, dating to roughly the same period. He'd used a hair gel made from plant oil and pine, resin imported from Spain or France, suggesting wealth or status. Someone had struck him on the head with an axe or similar weapon, then split his skull open, then disemboweled him before depositing him in the bog. Britain's Lindo Man tells a similar story. Killed sometime between 02 BC and AD 119, he was in his mid-20s, well-fed, with manicured fingernails suggesting he didn't perform manual labor. He'd been struck on the head twice. A cord was tied around his neck and twisted to strangle him. His throat was cut. Then he was placed face down in the bog. These patterns repeat across dozens of bog bodies. Young men, often showing signs of high status or good health, killed through multiple violent methods, deposited in bogs. The question is, why? One prominent theory links these deaths directly to the harvest cycle and, by extension, to Samhain. The theory of ritual murder of kings suggests a political, religious mechanism. If a king's reign coincided with disastrous crop failure, epidemic disease, military defeat, he was considered to have failed in his sacred duty. Kings weren't just political leaders in Celtic society. They were intermediaries between the human and divine realms. A king's success or failure reflected cosmic favor or disfavor. So a failed king wasn't just politically inconvenient, he was cosmically dangerous. His continued rule might anger the gods further, bringing worse disasters. The solution? Ritual execution to restore balance. The multiple methods of death, the triple death, might represent killing the victim in multiple ways. To ensure his death satisfied multiple realms or deities, or it might represent thoroughness, making absolutely certain the sacrifice was complete. The deposition in bogs liminal spaces between land and water, life and death, might represent sending the victim to the other world, or ensuring he couldn't return as a vengeful spirit. This transforms the bog buddies from random murders into something far more disturbing, a system, pattern of ritual violence tied directly to agricultural and political cycles. A mechanism for managing cosmic chaos through controlled human sacrifice. Was this happening specifically at Samhain? We can't be certain. The bog bodies can be radiocarbon dated to general time periods, but not to specific dates or seasons. However, the thematic connection is strong. Samhain marked the transition from harvest to winter, from plenty to scarcity, from life to death. If crops had failed, that failure would be apparent by Samhain. If winter looked likely to be catastrophic, that knowledge would be clear as Samhain approached. The timing makes sense for a ritual that dealt with failed harvests and doomed winters, and the practice persisted. While most bog bodies date to the Iron Age, roughly 500 BC to AD, 100th the tradition of depositing bodies in bogs continued sporadically into the Middle Ages, long after Christianity had officially replaced paganism. That suggests something deeper than casual disposal. The bogs held cultural significance that survived religious conversion. So here's what we're looking at with Samhain, a festival marking the beginning of the year's most dangerous period, a spiritual belief that the boundary between life and death dissolved completely, a pantheon of malevolent entities that could cross over and destroy you, elaborate community rituals designed to survive the night, and potentially, though debated, human sacrifice as the ultimate mechanism for reimposing cosmic order. This wasn't a party. This wasn't a quaint harvest celebration. This was existential terror with a structured response. And this is where Halloween began. Not with candy, not with cute decorations, not with corporate marketing campaigns, with fire and blood and desperate attempts to survive both physical winter and supernatural chaos. With costumes designed to hide you from entities that wanted to steal your children, with offerings meant to bribe malevolent forces into leaving your crops and livestock alone. When you carve a pumpkin this October, you're participating in a tradition that once meant the difference between life and death. When your kids wear costumes, they're unknowingly continuing a practice that began as spiritual camouflage against child-stealing fairies. When you gather around a bonfire, you're echoing a ritual designed to drive away supernatural predators. Samhain was the night the veil thinned, and everything humanity feared about death, darkness, and chaos could walk freely. The rituals, the terror, the violence, all of it was about making it to morning alive. And somehow, 3,000 years later, we're still observing variations of those same rituals. Different methods, same underlying anxiety. Because the veil still thins. We just call it something else now. Sell tickets to experience it, and pretend we're in control of the darkness. We're not. We never were. We just got better at commercializing our fear. We've established the spiritual terror of Samhain, the belief system, the supernatural threats, the desperate need for protection. Now we need to talk about the receipts, because belief systems are one thing, physical evidence is another, and the bogs of Northern Europe have kept meticulous records of exactly how far Iron Age communities were willing to go to survive the dark half of the year. The evidence is horrifying. Let's start with what we know happened during Samhain celebrations, even setting aside the human sacrifice question for a moment. These were not quiet, private affairs. Samhain was a massive communal event that involved the entire settlement, every family, every generation, everyone who needed to survive the next 6 months. The bonfires we discussed weren't just large, they were architectural achievements. Communities would spend days gathering wood, constructing these enormous pyres that would burn through the entire night and potentially into the next day. The fires served as gathering points where the community could witness and participate in collective rituals. Think of them as a combination of town hall, church, and fortress hall in the form of a massive blaze. Around these fires, Celtic communities engaged in what historical sources vaguely describe as fire rituals. The specifics have been lost or deliberately obscured, but we know they involve fortune-telling, divination, and appeals to supernatural forces. Some accounts describe people casting objects into the flames and interpreting how they burned. Nuts were popular for this. You'd name a nut for yourself or someone you cared about, throw it in the fire, and watch its behavior. If it burned quietly, good fortune ahead. If it exploded or jumped from the flames, maybe start making alternative plans. Other divination practices involved reflective surface-sized water, polished metal, mirrors once those became available. The goal was always the same: peek beyond the thinned veil and glimpse what the future held. Would you survive winter? Would your marriage last? Would the harvest be sufficient next year? These weren't idle curiosities. These were life and death questions requiring supernatural answers. But divination was the gentle part of Samhain rituals. The harder part, the part that separates historians into camps, involves what offerings were made to restore cosmic order and appease the forces of chaos. Animal sacrifice is uncontroversial. We know it happened. Livestock were ritually slaughtered, their blood offered to the gods and spirits, their meat preserved for winter consumption. This was practical religion killing. Animals you couldn't feed through winter anyway, making their death serve both spiritual and nutritional purposes. The gods got blood and honor. The community got food. Everyone theoretically won. But there's significant evidence suggesting that animals weren't the only offerings. This is where the bogs become our most valuable and most disturbing historical archive. Peat bogs are remarkable preservation environments. When organic material is deposited in a bog, the oxygen-deprived, acidic conditions prevent normal decomposition. Bacteria can't function. Soft tissue doesn't decay. Instead, it tans like leather, preserved in grotesque detail for millennia. Hair remains. Skin survives. Fingerprints stay intact. Even stomach contents can be analyzed to determine a victim's last meal. The bogs of Ireland, Britain, Denmark, Germany, and the Netherlands have yielded hundreds of bodies dating primarily to the Iron Age, the exact period when Samhain was being actively observed, and when forensic archaeologists examine these bodies, the manner of death follows disturbingly consistent patterns. These people were murdered, methodically, ritually, with specific violence that suggests ceremony rather than chaos. Let's examine the evidence case by case, starting with the Irish discoveries. Old Croghan Man was found in 2003 in a bog in County Offaly, Ireland. Radiocarbon dating placed his death between 362 and 175 B.C. firmly in the Iron Age. He was young, probably mid-20s, and stood over 6 feet tall, which was exceptionally large for the period. His hands showed no signs of manual labor, no calluses, no wear patterns from agricultural work. His fingernails were manicured. This was someone of high status, possibly nobility. Someone had killed him with deliberate brutality. His arms showed defensive wounds, cuts, indicating he'd tried to protect himself. Both his nipples had been cut off, an injury that appears in multiple Irish bog bodies and has led researchers to a disturbing theory. In ancient Celtic kingship rituals, sucking the king's nipples was apparently a gesture of submission, a physical acknowledgement of his authority. Removing them might represent the reversal of that authority, stripping a king of his symbolic power before killing him. After the mutilation, he was stabbed through the ribs. Then his head was cut off. His arms were severed. The separate pieces were deposited in the bog. He didn't just die, he was dismembered in a specific pattern. Clonachaven Man, discovered the same year in County Meath, tells an equally grim story. He was younger than old Croghan Man, late teens or early 20s and shorter, around 5'2", but like old Croghan Man, he showed clear signs of high status. His hair had been styled with a gel made from plant oil and pine resin, ingredients that had to be imported from continental Europe. In Iron Age Ireland, having access to imported hair products meant wealth, connections, status. He'd been struck on the head with an axe or similar implement, fracturing his skull. Then someone split his skull open further, exposing his brain. His torso was cut open and disemboweled. Only then was he placed in the bog, face up, as if displayed. These weren't crimes of passion. These weren't battlefield deaths. The violence was too methodical, too specific, to ritualized across the Irish Sea to Britain. And you find Linderman, discovered in 1984 in Cheshire, England. Linderman died sometime between 02 BC and AD 119. He was in his mid-20s, well-nourished, with manicured fingernails and no evidence of manual labor. His last meal, preserved perfectly in his stomach, was a griddle cake made from barley and wheat, with some seeds mixed in. He'd eaten it shortly before death, possibly as part of a ceremonial meal. Then came the violence. Someone struck him on the head twice with a heavy object, fracturing his skull. A cord was placed around his neck, twisted tight with a stick to create a garrote, strangling him. His throat was cut, severing the jugular vein. Finally, a knee was placed on his back, and he was forced face down into the bog water. 3 different killing methods: blunt trauma, strangulation, exsanguination. Archaeologists call this pattern threefold death or triple death, and it appears repeatedly across bog body discoveries. Why kill someone 3 different ways? One theory suggests it represents thoroughness, making absolutely certain the victim dies, leaving no chance of survival or supernatural return. Another theory ties it to Celtic religious beliefs about tripartite gods, or the sacred significance of the number 3 in Celtic cosmology. Perhaps each method satisfied a different deity or represented death in 3 realms simultaneously: the physical world, the spiritual world, and the other world. Or perhaps it was simply about making the death spectacular enough to count as a genuine sacrifice rather than mere murder. The pattern repeats with disturbing consistency. Grobel man from Denmark, dated to 290 BC, had his throat cut from ear to ear. Tolen man, also from Denmark, dated to approximately 375 BC, was hanged with a leather noose and then placed carefully in the bog with his eyes and mouth closed, as if sleeping. Linda woman from Britain had her throat cut and was then struck on the head. Eyed girl from the Netherlands was strangled with a woolen band, then stabbed, then deposited in the bog. Young adults. Evidence of good nutrition and high status. Multiple methods of violent death. Careful deposition in bogs. The question that divides historians is, why? Were these criminals being executed? Possible, but the evidence argues against it. Criminals weren't typically buried with care. They weren't well fed before death. They didn't show signs of high status. And criminal execution doesn't typically involve multiple simultaneous killing methods. Were these war captives or slaves being killed? Again, unlikely. War captives show evidence of combat injuries before death. They're malnourished. They lack the signs of status seen in bog buddies. And there's no strategic reason to ritually murder war captives in bogs rather than simply killing them and moving on. Were these human sacrifices tied directly to religious and political systems? That's where the evidence points. The theory gaining the most scholarly support is the ritual murder of kings hypothesis. It works like this. In Iron Age Celtic society, kingship wasn't just political authority. It was sacred responsibility. A king was believed to be married to the land itself, symbolic union that made his personal success or failure directly tied to the land's fertility and prosperity. Good king, good harvest, blessed king, blessed community, failed king, disaster. If crops failed during the king's reign, that wasn't just bad luck, it was cosmic judgment. The king had failed in his sacred duty. He had lost the god's favor. His continued rule endangered the entire community because divine displeasure might bring worse disasters, plague, invasion, perpetual famine. The solution was removal. Permanent removal. But you couldn't just assassinate a sacred king and move on. That would compound the cosmic offense. The removal had to be ritualized, transformed into a sacrifice that restored balance rather than deepening chaos. The king's death had to mean something. had to count as an offering significant enough to repair the broken relationship between community and cosmos. Hence the elaborate violence, hence the multiple methods of death, hence the deposition in bogs liminal spaces between land and water, between life and death, between the mortal realm and the other world. The evidence supporting this theory is circumstantial but compelling. Many bog bodies show signs of high-status manicured nails, good nutrition, expensive hair products, evidence of lives free from manual labor. These weren't random peasants. These weren't elites. In several cases, like old Croghan men, the specific injuries, particularly the removal of nipples, tie directly to kingship symbolism. The timing also fits. Most bog bodies cluster in periods of known environmental stress. Climate data from ice cores and tree rings shows that Northern Europe experienced significant agricultural challenges during the Iron Age periods of crop failure, harsh winters, extended droughts. These would be precisely the conditions that might trigger a failed king ritual. And here's what makes this genuinely chilling as a historical mechanism. It worked. Not in the sense that killing a king actually improved the weather or magically restored failed crops, but it worked as social technology. It provided a visible, dramatic response to crises. It gave the community a mechanism for processing disaster and trauma. It created a scapegoat whose death could symbolically contain all the accumulated bad fortune. Most importantly, it imposed order on chaos. When everything was falling apart, when crops failed, when people starved, when winter threatened to kill, everyone the ritual sacrifice provided structure, clear roles, specific actions, an endpoint to the crisis, even if that endpoint was someone's ritualized death. This is cosmic accountability enforced through political terror. The king reigned with absolute authority, but that authority came with an implicit threat: fail, and the bogs await you. Think about the psychological weight of that system. Every king knew the stakes. Every bad harvest brought suspicion. Every prolonged winter raised questions. The power was immense, but so was the existential danger. You ruled at the pleasure of the gods, and the gods were apparently very hard to please. And this practice didn't end cleanly with the arrival of Christianity. While the peak of bog-bodied depositions was during the Iron Age, roughly 500 BC to AD, 100 the tradition persisted sporadically for centuries afterward. Bodies dated to the early Middle Ages have been found in bogs across northern Europe. Long after Christianity had become the dominant religion and pagan practices had supposedly been stamped out, that persistence suggests something deeper than simple religious ritual. The bogs held cultural significance that transcended specific belief systems. They were places of power, places of mystery, places where the boundary between worlds felt thin, not just on Samhain, but always. So when we talk about sane rituals, we're not discussing abstract spiritual beliefs or harmless folk customs. We're discussing a system that, at its most extreme, involved the ritualized execution of high-status individuals. Their bodies carefully deposited in sacred liminal spaces as offerings to restore cosmic balance. The bonfires, those were the visible part. The public ceremony where everyone gathered. The costumes, spiritual camouflage for regular people trying to survive the night. The offerings of food and drink, appeasement for lesser spirits and ancestors. But the bogs were where the serious business happened, where cosmic debt was paid in blood, where failed kings ended their reigns face down in oxygen-free water, their bodies preserved for millennia as testimony to how far communities would go to survive. This is the foundation of Halloween. Not the Disney version, not the candy-coated modern commercialization, the actual, historical, documented by preserved corpses foundation. A festival that began with human sacrifice tied to agricultural success and political survival. And before you think this sounds too dark to possibly be connected to modern trick-or-treating, remember, we're only 2 chapters into this transformation. Halloween survived because it adapted. The methods changed. The underlying need to confront and manage existential terror remained constant. The bogs kept their secrets for thousands of years. Modern science revealed them, and now we know. When the Celts talked about the veil thinning, when they performed elaborate rituals to survive Samhain, when they made offerings to restore balance, they weren't speaking metaphorically. They were deadly serious. Literally. Empires have a way of changing holidays, sometimes through violence, sometimes through strategic co-option, but always through the calculated absorption of local practices into imperial frameworks. The Roman conquest of Celtic lands didn't just redraw maps, it rewrote the spiritual calendar. And then Christianity came along and rewrote it again. By the time we reached the medieval period, Samhain had been layered over, rebranded, and theologically repackaged so thoroughly that its original function was almost unrecognizable. Almost because the core themes, death, the supernatural, the thinning of boundaries, those persisted. They just got new management. Let's start with Rome. The Roman Empire spent centuries expanding, and by the 1st century BC they'd conquered most of Celtic Europe, including Gaul, modern France, parts of Britain, and territories across what's now Spain and Central Europe. When you conquer territory, you don't just govern land, you govern culture. And Rome had a specific playbook for cultural integration. Absorb what you can, suppress what you can't, and blend everything into something manageable. Celtic religious practices posed a problem. The Druids, the priestly class, who conducted rituals like Samhain, held significant political power. They were educators, judges, spiritual authorities, and keepers of oral tradition, all rolled into one. Rome didn't appreciate competing power structures, especially ones that involved human sacrifice and potential rebellion. So Rome suppressed the Druids violently in many cases. Julius Caesar wrote about Druidic practices with a mixture of fascination and horror, describing their use of massive wooden effigies filled with living people and set on fire as sacrifices. Whether these accounts were accurate or Roman propaganda designed to justify conquest is debated. But either way, the Druids were targeted for elimination. The festivals, however, those were more complicated. You can kill priests, but eradicating deeply embedded cultural practices from entire populations is harder. Samhain wasn't just a religious observation, it was a temporal marker, an agricultural milestone, a community gathering, and a psychological necessity. People needed a mechanism for acknowledging the transition into winter and confronting their fear of death and chaos. You couldn't just ban that and expect compliance. So Rome did what Rome did best: strategic syncretism. Blend the local festival with existing Roman observances, create a hybrid that satisfies both populations, and move on. Rome had its own festivals, dealing with death and the afterlife, Ferelia, celebrated in late February, was dedicated to honoring the dead specifically, appeasing the spirits of deceased ancestors to prevent them from causing trouble for the living. Families would visit graves, leave offerings of food and wine, and perform rituals to ensure their ancestors remained peaceful and benevolent. Sound familiar? The emphasis on honoring dead ancestors, making offerings to appease spirits, ensuring they don't cause harm. These are the same concerns that drove Samhain practices, just with Roman cultural packaging. Rome also celebrated Pomona, the goddess of fruit trees, orchards, and gardens. Her festival, celebrated in early November, involved offerings of apples and other autumn fruits, prayers for future harvests, and celebrations of the season's bounty. Pomona's symbol was the apple, and historical analysis strongly suggests this is the direct origin of apple bobbing. Pictured the evolution. Celtic communities had their own divination practices involving fruits and nuts. Romans introduced structured festivals honoring Pomona. The two traditions merged in conquered Celtic territories, creating hybrid celebrations that featured both Celtic spiritual concerns and Roman agricultural themes. By the medieval period, apple bobbing had become a standard Halloween gamer, direct inheritance from Pomona's apple symbolism filtered through centuries of cultural blending. So by the time Christianity arrived in force, Celtic territories were already celebrating a hybrid festival. Samhain's original terror had been somewhat softened by Roman influence, blended with festivals that emphasized community, harvest celebration, and orderly veneration of ancestors, rather than desperate survival against malevolent supernatural forces. But Christianity was about to add another layer entirely. The Church faced a familiar problem. Across Europe, local populations clung to their traditional festivals despite official conversion to Christianity. You could build churches, install bishops, conduct mass baptisms, but getting people to actually abandon their ancestral observances, that required a different strategy. The strategy, articulated most clearly by Pope Gregory I in the 6th century, was explicit. Don't destroy pagan temples and festivals, repurpose them. Convert temples into churches. Transform pagan observances into Christian holy days. Give people continuity while changing the theological framework. By the 8th century, this strategy was applied directly to the Samhain-Pomona hybrid that late Orton had become. Pope Gregory III, who reigned from 731 to 741, designated November 1st as All Saints' Day, day to honor all Christian saints and martyrs, particularly those who didn't have their own specific feast days. This wasn't a new holiday. All Saints' Day had existed since the 4th century, but it had been celebrated in the spring, usually in May. Gregory III moved it deliberately. Strategically, he relocated All Saints' Day to November 1st, placing it directly adjacent to, depending on how you calculated the day's beginning, directly on top of the date Celtic communities observed Samhain. Coincidence? Historians debate this. Some argue the Church intentionally stole the date, knowing that people would continue gathering in late October regardless of official theology, and the Church wanted to control that gathering. Others contend that the timing arose independently, or that the Church was simply accommodating existing local customs by providing Christian alternatives. The practical effect was the same either way. November 1st became All Saints, All Hallows Day in Older English. Hallows meaning saints or holy persons, and the evening before, that became All Hallows Eve, eventually shortened to All Hallows Eve, then Halloween, and finally Halloween. The name we use today is literally the evening before the day we honor saints, a Christian designation for what had been a pagan festival of survival against supernatural chaos. But the Church didn't stop with one day. In the 10th century, the Church added November 2nd as All Souls' Day, dedicated specifically to praying for the souls of all faithful Christians who had died and were believed to be in purgatory, the theological concept of a temporary afterlife location where souls were purified of sins before entering heaven. Now you had a 3-day observation. October 31st, All Hallows Eve. November 1st, All Saints' Day, and November 2nd, All Souls' Day, collectively known as All Hallowtide. 3 days focused entirely on death, the afterlife, and the relationship between the living and the dead. Sound familiar? It should Samhain had been a multi-day festival marking the transition into the dark half. The Celts believed the veil thinned, allowing interaction between living and dead. All Hallowtide maintained that timeline, and that thematic focus had just replaced Celtic cosmology with Christian theology. But here's where the theological shift becomes significant. Samhain focused on chaos. The veil thinning meant unpredictable, danger-malevolent spirits. The AOSC, demons, harmful, supernatural forces. You protected yourself through disguise, offerings, and ritual. The dead weren't necessarily benevolent. The other world wasn't orderly. Anything could happen. All Hallowtide replaced that chaos with order. The Christian framework provided clear categories. Saints in heaven honored on All Saints' Day. Souls in purgatory prayed for on All Souls' Day, and the damned in hell not mentioned because praying for them was considered useless. The uncertainty of Samhain was replaced with theological structure. You knew where souls went. You knew how to help them. You knew the rules. Instead of fearing the capricious AOSC, you prayed for your Christian ancestors suffering temporary punishment in purgatory. Instead of making offerings to appease malevolent entities, you gave alms to the poor or the church to reduce your own time in purgatory or help deceased relatives escape it faster. Instead of wearing disguises to hide from supernatural predators, you participated in church services honoring the saints who'd successfully navigated death and reached heaven. The fear was contained, domesticated, channeled into acceptable Christian practices. But, and this is crucial, the old practices didn't disappear. They went underground, persisted in rural areas, or got rebranded with Christian justifications. Divination practices, for instance, continued throughout the Christian period, particularly in rural Ireland and Scotland, where church authority was weaker and Celtic cultural memory stronger. The Church officially frowned on divination. Consulting supernatural forces to predict the future was theologically problematic, potentially heretical, definitely suspect. But people kept doing it anyway, especially on October 31st, when the veil was still believed to be thin, Christian theology or not. Nutcrack Night was a particularly popular divination ritual that persisted well into the modern era. The practice was simple but symbolically loaded. You take 2 uncooked hazelnuts and name them for yourself and a romantic partner for a couple you were curious about. Then you'd place both nuts in the fire and watch what happened. If the nuts burned quietly together, staying close, that predicted a happy, stable relationship. Marriage material. Grow old together, die peacefully in each other's arms, the whole romantic ideal. If the nuts flew apart violently, popping from the heat and scattering in different directions, that relationship was doomed. Separation ahead. Find someone else. Think about the psychology here. You're young, unmarried, facing uncertain future prospects in a society where marriage was essential for social and economic survival. The fire, that same element your ancestors used to ward off Samhain spirits, could supposedly tell you whether your romantic hopes had any chance of success. The ritual gave you a sense of control, even if that control was illusory. Mirror gazing was another persistent divination practice, this one specifically targeting young, unmarried women. The ritual varied regionally, but the core was consistent. You'd light a candle, sit before a mirror, and stare into the reflection while performing some action, eating an apple, combing your hair, saying a specific phrase. If you did it correctly, you'd supposedly glimpse the face of your future husband in the mirror behind you. But the folklore came with warnings. Sometimes you didn't see your husband. Sometimes you saw a mocking, impetrickster spirit taking advantage of the thinned veil to mess with you. Sometimes you saw a ghost, someone dead, perhaps your own death approaching. And sometimes, most terrifyingly, you saw the face of death itself, a shrouded figure, a premonition of dying before marriage. The ritual was simultaneously hopeful and terrifying, which perfectly captures the tension of these surviving Celtic practices under Christian overlay. You wanted to peek beyond the veil, to glimpse the future, to gain some certainty about your fate. But peeking beyond the veil was inherently dangerous. The other world didn't care about your romantic curiosity. It had its own agenda, these divination customs and dozens of others involving apples, water, lead pouring, candle watching, demonstrate that ordinary people never fully accepted the Christian domestication of October 31st. The Church could overlay All Hallows Eve, designate official observances, provide theological frameworks, but at the village level, in rural cottages, around kitchen fires, people still treated the night as Celtic tradition had as a moment when the boundary thinned and supernatural knowledge became accessible. The tension between official Christian theology and persistent folk practice would define Halloween for centuries. The Church controlled the public observances, the formal rituals, the theological interpretation. But folk culture controlled the private practices, the superstitions, the lived experience of the night. And in that gap between official religion and folk practice, Halloween found room to survive, adapt, and eventually transform into something neither purely pagan nor fully Christian. The apple bobbing you see at Halloween parties, Pomona's gift, filtered through Celtic divination traditions, blessed by medieval Christians who saw it as harmless fun. The jack-o'-lantern we'll discuss later. Celtic protective talismans, repurposed by Christian communities, eventually commercialized by American consumer culture. The costumes, Celtic spiritual camouflage, partially abandoned under Christian influence, then revived in different form. Each layer added something. Each layer changed the meaning. But the core remained. October 31st was special. The boundary was thin. Death was close, and humanity needed rituals to manage that closeness. Rome added order and harvest celebration to Celtic chaos. Christianity added theological structure and saint veneration to pagan fear, but neither fully erased what came before. They couldn't. The need was too deep, the fear too persistent, the cultural memory too strong. So Samhain became All Hallows Eve. The AOSC became demons and ghosts. Ritual sacrifice became prayer for souls in purgatory. Bonfires became church candles. But the night remained dark, the veil remained thin, and people remained deeply, fundamentally aware that death was always just one breath away. The medieval period would take that awareness and transform it into an entire aesthetic movement. Because if Christianity taught you anything, it's that contemplating your own death wasn't just acceptable, it was spiritually necessary. And medieval Europeans took that lesson to genuinely disturbing extremes. And medieval Europeans took that lesson to genuinely disturbing extremes. If you thought Celtic ritual sacrifice was dark, wait until you see what Christianity did with death imagery once it had a few centuries to get creative. Medieval Europe didn't just acknowledge death, it obsessed over it, marinated in it, built an entire artistic and theological movement around reminding people constantly and graphically that they were going to die horribly and possibly spend eternity suffering for it. And this obsession directly shaped what Halloween would eventually become, because the medieval fixation on mortality created the visual vocabulary, the emotional tone, and the cultural permission to make death decorative. Let's set the scene. Life in medieval Europe was, to borrow Thomas Hobbes' later description, nasty, brutish, and short. Average life expectancy hovered around 30 to 35 years, and that's counting everyone. Infant mortality was catastrophic. Somewhere between 30 and 50% of children died before age 5. If you made it to adulthood, you might reach 50 or 60, but that was considered exceptionally old. The causes of death were everywhere and relentless. Famine was a regular occurrence. Crop failures meant starvation, and crop failures happened with depressing frequency due to unpredictable weather, primitive agricultural techniques, and lack of food storage technology. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 killed millions across Europe. People literally starved in the streets. Disease was even worse. The Black Death bubonic plague arrived in Europe in 1347 and killed an estimated 1/3 to 1/2 of the entire population. Within 5 years, 30 to 50 million people dead, villages emptied, cities decimated, the social fabric torn apart, and the plague kept coming back, recurring every few decades for centuries. Beyond famine and disease, there was violence. Warfare was constant. The 100 Years' War, the Crusades, endless smaller conflicts between nobles, kingdoms, and competing powers. Combat was brutal and personal swords, axes, arrows, hand-to-hand fighting that left bodies mutilated. Medical treatment was primitive, so even minor wounds often turned fatal through infection. Childbirth killed enormous numbers of women. Simple infections killed children. Accidents killed workers. Violence killed travelers. There was no escape from death. It was visible, immediate, and constantly present. So how did medieval Christians cope with this relentless mortality? They developed a philosophy called memento mori Latin, for remember death, or remember you must die. This wasn't meant to be depressing, though it absolutely was. The theological purpose of memento mori was spiritual preparation. Christianity taught that your eternal fate, heaven, hell, or purgatory, was determined by your spiritual state at the moment of death. If you died in a state of grace, confessed, and absolved, you had a chance at heaven. If you died in sin, hell awaited. If you were somewhere in between, purgatory would purify you. But that purification involved torture that made earthly suffering look pleasant. The stakes were literally infinite. Eternal bliss versus eternal torment. Forever in paradise or forever in flames. No second chances. No appeals. Just death, judgment, and eternity. Given those stakes, constant awareness of death's imminence wasn't morbid, it was practical. You needed to be ready, always, because death could come at any moment, and you didn't get to choose when. So medieval culture developed an entire industry around death reminders. Art was created specifically to terrify people into repentance. Objects were designed to keep mortality at the front of your consciousness. Churches commissioned works that depicted death in the most graphic, horrifying terms possible, because if the imagery was disturbing enough, maybe you'd take your spiritual preparation seriously. This is where Halloween's visual aesthetic really begins. Not with Celtic bonfires or Christian theology, but with medieval death art that made mortality tangible, immediate, and deeply unsettling. The most famous example of this aesthetic is the Danse Macabre, the Dance of Death. This is where Halloween's visual aesthetic really begins. Not with Celtic bonfires or Christian theology, but with medieval death art that made mortality tangible, immediate, and deeply unsettling. The most famous example of this aesthetic is the Danse Macabre, the Dance of Death. The Danse Macabre depicted skeletons or, sometimes, rotting cadavers in various stages of decaying a procession of living people toward the grave. And here's what made it socially radical. The procession included everyone. At the front might be the Pope, the highest religious authority on earth. Next came emperors and kings, the most powerful political figures, then nobles, merchants, craftsmen, peasants, and beggars. Every social class, every profession, every level of the medieval hierarchy, all being led by death. The message was one of absolute, terrifying equality. What we were, you are. What we are, you will be. No amount of wealth protects you. No political power saves you. No religious authority grants exemption. Death comes for everyone, and death doesn't care about your resume. Think about how radical this message was in a society built entirely on rigid hierarchy. Medieval Europe was structured around the concept that some people were simply better than others. Nobles above commoners, clergy above laity, men above women, masters above servants. Your social position was considered ordained by God, permanent and justified. And here comes the Danse Macabre saying, none of that matters. The skeleton leading the Pope to his grave doesn't care that he's the Pope. The corpse dragging the king away doesn't bow to royal authority. Death is the ultimate leveler, and everyone's up the same way. Rotting, decayed, skeletal, forgotten. The Danse Macabre served dual purposes. On the religious level, it warned about the transience of worldly wealth and the necessity of spiritual preparation. All your money, power, and status means nothing after death, so focus on your soul instead of material concerns. On the social level, probably unintentionally, it functioned as critique. By showing all classes equally subject to death, it implicitly questioned the validity of social hierarchy. If everyone ends up as bones, maybe the elaborate class distinctions of life are somewhat arbitrary. Medieval audiences wouldn't have articulated it that way, but the subversive message was embedded in the imagery. And the imagery was everywhere. Churches wanted you to see the Danse Macabre. Parish priests wanted you contemplating it. The goal was to make death so present, so visible, so unavoidable in your daily consciousness that you'd focus on spiritual preparation instead of earthly concerns. But the Danse Macabre wasn't the only death imagery medieval people encountered. It was just the most famous prayer books of ours, used by literate Christians to recite daily prayers, often contained elaborate illustrations designed to focus the reader's mind on mortality. These weren't gentle, peaceful images of people quietly passing away, surrounded by loved ones. These were graphic, detailed, actively disturbing visualizations intended to provoke fear and repentance. Common illustrations included deathbed scenes showing people in obvious agony, surrounded by grieving relatives, while demons lurked nearby, waiting to claim the soul. The dying person's face would be twisted in pain or terror. The demons would be grotesque-horned, clawed, with animal features and expressions of gleeful malice. The message: death is suffering, and what comes after might be worse. Other illustrations depicted funeral rites in elaborate detail, the body being prepared, the corpse in its shroud, the burial, the decomposition. Some books included images of open graves, with partially decayed corpses visible, reminding readers that this is what awaits all flesh. Particularly popular were images of souls in purgatory, shown as naked human figures surrounded by flames, tormented by devils wielding various implements of torture. These souls weren't damned, eventually reach heaven, but first they had to be purified through suffering. The imagery was meant to motivate the living to pray for these souls, give alms to reduce their time in purgatory, and most importantly avoid ending up there yourself. The visual representation of death itself evolved into a specific iconography. Death appeared as a skeleton, often covered in strips of rotting flesh, sometimes with worms or maggots visible in the decaying tissue. Death carried tool scythes, hourglasses, arrows, spears, implements for harvesting souls or marking time's passage. One particularly disturbing common image showed death as an animated corpse, not fully skeletal but partially decayed, with exposed bone, hanging flesh, hollow eye sockets, and a grotesque grin. This figure would be depicted holding multiple sickles, as if harvesting souls en masse, working overtime during plague years. Another frequent motif was the 3 living and the 3 dead, a narrative scene showing 3 wealthy young nobles out hunting or traveling, who encounter 3 corpses that have risen from their graves. The corpses speak to the nobles, warning them, "What you are, we once were. What we are, you will become." The nobles' faces show shock, horror, and terror as they confront their own mortality made literal. Think about encountering these images regularly. You're a medieval Christian, you can't read well, so the pictures do most of the teaching. You open your prayer book or look at your church's walls, and there's death grinning at you. There are corpses rotting, there are souls burning, there are demons waiting. This was the medieval equivalent of horror entertainment, except it wasn't entertainment. It was theology. It was education. It was the church's method of ensuring you took the afterlife seriously. And here's what makes this directly relevant to Halloween. Early Christian accounts of hell and purgatory were actually quite vague. The Bible doesn't provide detailed architectural layouts of hell or step-by-step descriptions of how demons torture souls. The descriptions are metaphorical: lake of fire, outer darkness, weeping and gnashing of teeth, leaving lots of room for interpretation. Medieval artists filled that interpretive void with increasingly elaborate and disturbing visualizations. They invented the iconography of healthy demons, the torture implements, the specific punishments for specific sins. They created the visual language of death and damnation that we still reference today. When you see a skeleton in a black robe holding a scythe, that's medieval death imagery. When haunted houses feature devils with pitchforks, that's medieval hell iconography. When horror movies show corpses rising from graves, that's the three living and the three dead. When Halloween decorations include skeletons dancing, that's the dongs, macabre, commercialized. The entire aesthetic vocabulary of Halloween's skeletons, corpses, demons, death personified comes directly from medieval Christian art designed to terrify people into spiritual compliance. The irony is almost beautiful. The Church created this imagery to promote piety, prayer, and fear of judgment. Medieval artists spent centuries perfecting the visualization of death, decay, and damnation to serve theological purposes. And then, centuries later, that same imagery became entertainment. Decoration, fun. The skeletons meant to remind you of hell became plastic party favors. The corpses meant to provoke repentance became haunted house props. The demons meant to represent eternal torment became costume options. Halloween took medieval death obsession and stripped away the theology, keeping only the aesthetics. Same imagery, completely different purpose. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. In the medieval period, this imagery was deadly serious. Literally, people genuinely believed they might die at any moment and face immediate judgment. The art wasn't exaggeration, was what they thought actually awaited them. And that belief shaped behavior. People gave enormous sums to the church hoping to buy reduced time in purgatory. Entire fortunes were donated to fund prayers for the dead. Elaborate funeral arrangements were made, paying priests to say masses for decades after death. The fear of hell and purgatory motivated charity, piety, and substantial economic transfer to religious institutions. It also shaped the lay totem observances. All Hallowtide, those 3 days in late October and early November, became a focal point for this death obsession. All Saints' Day honored those who'd successfully navigated death and reached heaven. All Souls' Day prayed for those stuck in purgatory. And the evening before All Hallows Eve was when the boundary felt thinnest, when the living could most effectively communicate with or pray for the dead. The old Celtic belief that the veil thinned never disappeared. It just got recontextualized. Instead of fearing the AOSer crossing over to steal children, medieval Christians believed souls in purgatory could be helped by prayers offered when the veil was thin. Instead of wearing disguises to hide from malevolent entities, people participated in church services honoring the holy dead who'd conquered death through faith. But the fear remained. The sense that October 31st was spiritually dangerous persisted. The night still felt different, liminal, uncertain, touched by death. And in that persistent unease, Halloween found its emotional core. Not joy, not celebration, unease. The sensation that something about this night is fundamentally wrong, that the normal rules don't quite apply, that death is closer than usual. Medieval culture took that unease and amplified it through graphic death imagery, theological terror, and constant reminders of mortality. They created an entire aesthetic language for expressing existential dread. They just didn't realize they were building the foundation for a billion-dollar holiday industry. Because that imagery, those skeletons, those corpses, those demons, that pervasive sense of death made visible would persist long after medieval theology lost its grip on daily life. The forms would remain even as the meaning drained away. And centuries later, we'd be carving pumpkins with those grotesque faces, hanging plastic skeletons as decorations, and taking our children to haunted houses, featuring medieval hell imagery repurposed as entertainment. The medieval obsession with mortality didn't create Halloween, but it created Halloween's look, its tone, its permission to make death decorative and fear recreational, which raises an interesting question. If the imagery came from medieval death art, and the timing came from Celtic Samhain filtered through Christian All Hallows Eve, where did the practice of going door to door demanding treats come from? That story involves poverty, prayer, and a spiritual economy that sounds almost too grim to be true. Almost. Modern trick-or-treating feels innocent enough. Kids in costumes, neighborhood walks, candy, maybe some mild extortion in the form of trick-or-treat, but it's all performative. Nobody's actually threatening anything. But the door-to-door tradition didn't start innocent. It started as economic desperation, dressed up as religious service, combined with traveling performers using death and resurrection narratives to earn food and money. The medieval version of trick-or-treating was poverty management. Spiritual transaction and entertainment all rolled into one uncomfortable package. Welcome to souling and guising the practices that directly evolved into modern Halloween begging. Minus the begging part and most of the existential dread. Let's start with souling, because it's the more theologically interesting of the two. Souling was a Christian custom that emerged during the medieval period in England and Ireland, practiced primarily during All Hallows Eve, those 3 days in late October and early November dedicated to the dead. The practice was simple in mechanics but complex in implications. Poor people, often children, would go door to door requesting soul cakes from wealthier households. Soul cakes were small, round, spiced biscuits or bread rolls, usually marked with a cross to signify their religious purpose. They weren't elaborate. Flour, sugar, or honey. Spices like nutmeg or cinnamon, sometimes currants or raisins. Basic ingredients shaped into something that could be easily produced in quantity and wouldn't spoil quickly. But here's what made soul cakes different from ordinary charity. They came with strings attached. When Solas, the people requesting soul cakes, knocked on your door, they weren't just asking for food. They were offering a service. Specifically, they would pray for your dead relatives believed to be suffering in purgatory. You gave them soul cakes. They prayed for your deceased grandmother, uncle, parents, whoever in your family tree was currently being purified through supernatural torture before admission to heaven. The transaction was explicit and calculated. More cakes meant more prayers. Each cake given supposedly corresponded to a soul's reduced time in purgatory. The Celts would sing songs often rhyming verses that explained the transaction. A soul cake, a soul cake. Please, good missus, a soul cake. 1 for Peter, 2 for Paul, 3 for him who made us all. Other versions were more direct about the exchange. Soul, soul, for a soul cake, cray you. Good missus, a soul cake. The theological premise was grim but straightforward. Medieval Christianity taught that most people weren't saintly enough for immediate heaven, but weren't wicked enough for immediate hell. They ended up in purgatory temporary, afterlife holding zone where souls were cleansed of their sins through suffering. The torments of purgatory were described as comparable to hell, just not eternal. You'd burn, suffer, be tortured, but eventually, once purified, you'd be allowed into heaven. The length of time in purgatory depended on how sinful you'd been in life. Minor sins, maybe a few years. Major sins could be centuries or longer. And while you were there, suffering, the only thing that could reduce your sentence was prayer from the living. Living relatives could pray for you. The church could say masses for your soul. And during All Hallows, when the veil between worlds was believed to be thinnest, those prayers were thought to be especially effective. So here's the economic and spiritual mechanism. You're a wealthy medieval household. You have dead relatives. You believe those relatives are currently burning in purgatory, suffering horribly, awaiting enough prayer to be released. You could pray for them yourself, but you're busy, and honestly, you're not entirely confident in your own spiritual standing. You might need those prayers for yourself later. Enter the Celts. Poor people, often children, who have time to pray and are willing to do so in exchange for food. You give them soul cakes, they pray for your dead. Everyone theoretically benefits. You've offloaded your spiritual obligation to professionals. The poor get fed. Your dead relatives get prayer time subtracted from their purgatorial sentence. It's a spiritual economy driven by poverty and fear. The poor needed food. That was non-negotiable. Survival in medieval society for those without land or stable employment meant constant hustle begging. Performing odd jobs, taking advantage of charitable customs. Souling was one of those customs. It formalized begging by making it a religious service rather than pure dependency. The wealthy needed spiritual insurance. They feared death and judgment. They feared purgatory. They feared failing their dead relatives. Paying for prayers was standard practice. Wealthy people would endow churches or monasteries with money specifically to fund masses for their souls after death. Soul cakes were a cheaper, more immediate version of the same transaction. The church benefited by maintaining control over the afterlife narrative and keeping people focused on sin, judgment, and the necessity of constant prayer. And by positioning themselves as the primary intermediary between living and dead, the church ensured a steady stream of donations, endowments, and economic power. Souling was poverty management, but it was also social control. It gave the poor a mechanism for survival that didn't involve theft or rebellion. It reinforced class hierarchy. The wealthy gave, the poor received and performed service. It maintained theological fear as a motivating force, and it established a precedent. Going door to door during All Hallows to request something in exchange for a service or performance was acceptable. Expected behavior, That precedent is crucial because it's the direct ancestor of modern trick-or-treating. The mechanics evolved, candy replaced soul cakes. Performances became optional. The spiritual transaction disappeared, but the basic framework remained. Children go door to door during Halloween, knock, make a request, and receive food in return. Souling provides the economic model, but the performance aspect, that came from guising. Guising, also called mumming, was a parallel tradition that involved masked or disguised individuals traveling from house to house or village to village, performing entertainment plays, dances, songs, jokes, or stunts in exchange for food, money, or drink. The disguises were improvisational and often unsettling. People wore strips of fabric wrapped around their bodies and faces, making themselves unrecognizable. Cross-dressing was common, men dressed as women, women as men, violating normal social codes for the length of the performance. Face coverings were made from whatever was available: cloth, straw, animal skins. People would alter their faces using whatever pigments they could access: soot from fires, lard mixed with ash, brick dust for red coloring. The goal was disguise, total transformation. You weren't supposed to be recognizable as yourself. The mask or costume separated your everyday identity from your performance identity, allowing you to behave in ways normal social rules might not permit. The performances themselves often followed specific narrative patterns, particularly in mumming plays. These weren't improvised chaos. They were structured dramas with fixed roles and predictable plots, passed down through oral tradition and performed annually. The most common narrative framework involved death and resurrection. A typical mumming play would feature a champion or hero figure, often a knight, sometimes St. George from dragon-slaying fame, occasionally a local folk hero, a challenger, another warrior, a Turkish knight, a dragon, some antagonist representing threat or chaos. A fight scene, exaggerated theatrical combat where the champion is killed, not wounded, not defeated, killed. He falls dramatically and lies still. A Dr. Characterform played for comic effect, who claims he can cure anything. He's summoned, arrives with great fanfare, and performs a miraculous healing using absurd methods. The resurrection, the champion rises, restored to life, often leading to celebration, dancing, and requests for food or money from the audience. This narrative death followed by resurrection, loss followed by renewal directly echoed the agricultural cycle that Samhain originally marked. The year dies, winter comes, but spring returns, and life is renewed. The harvest ends, but next year's harvest will grow. Death isn't final. It's part of a cycle. Sound familiar? It should. This is Samhain's thematic core, preserved through Christian overlay, performed by traveling entertainers as folk drama. The mumming plays maintained the idea that late autumn was about confronting death and affirming renewal. They just did it through theatre instead of bonfires and blood. Geysers weren't necessarily poor in the way Sowlers were. Some were semi-professional entertainers. Some were young men from the village performing as tradition. Some were genuinely desperate and used performance as survival strategy. But regardless of motivation, they all relied on the same social contract. I will entertain you, and you will feed me. And crucially, both souling and guising happened specifically during All Hallows Eve, late October, early November, when the year turned dark and communities gathered to acknowledge death, honor the dead, and pray for souls in purgatory. These door-to-door customs became embedded in the seasonal observation. When Irish and Scottish immigrants brought these traditions to North America in the 19th century, particularly during and after the Great Famine of the 1840s, souling and guising traveled with them, but they arrived fragmented, separated from their original theological context, blended with other customs, and ready for transformation. Early American versions of Halloween, before it became commercialized, before it became candy-focused, before trick-or-treat became the standard phrase, required the performer to actually perform. You were expected to offer a trick in exchange for the treat. Not a prank or vandalism threat. Trick meant a talent, a song, a poem, a dance, a joke, a stunt. You had to earn the treat through voluntary display of skill. This nuance is important because it demonstrates that the original custom emphasized reciprocity. You weren't just demanding food, you were providing entertainment, companionship, or in the case of souling, spiritual service. There was exchange, not extortion. But as we'll see, that emphasis on reciprocity and performance wouldn't survive contact with 20th century American urbanization and economic stress. The trick component would shift from entertainment to threat, from voluntary skill display to vandalism warning. The transformation from souling and guising to modern trick-or-treating required several more evolutionary steps, most of them involving property destruction, municipal crisis, and desperate civic intervention. But first, we need to talk about turnips. Carved turnips. Grotesque, terrifying, candlelit turnips that represented eternal damnation and wandering spirits. Because while poor people were going door to door trading prayers and performances for food, other people were carving vegetables into horrifying faces and lighting them to ward off supernatural threats. And those carved vegetables would become the single most recognizable symbol of Halloween once Americans figured out that pumpkins were way easier to carve than turnips. That story involves Irish folklore, eternal damnation, and a drunk trickster who managed to get banned from both heaven and hell. His name was Jack. He was stingy, and his legacy is sitting on your porch right now, illuminated and grinning. Jack-o'-lanterns weren't decoration. They were protection against a man so terrible that even the devil didn't want him. The jack-o'-lantern tradition originates in Ireland and Britain, where people didn't have access to pumpkins. North America had pumpkins. Europe had root vegetables, turnips, mango wurzels, rutabagas, large radishes, potatoes. These vegetables were what you had available in late autumn, so these were what you carved. And carving root vegetables is miserable. Turnips are dense, fibrous, difficult to hollow out. They're small compared to pumpkins, giving you limited space to work with. The flesh is tough and resistant. Carving a face into a turnip required serious effort, sharp tools, and considerable time. You couldn't just casually whip one out like modern pumpkin carving. This was labor, but people did it anyway, because the carved lanterns served a specific purpose, warding off wandering spirits and harmful entities during Samhain and All Hallows Eve. The faces carved into these turnips weren't cute or friendly. They were deliberately grotesquicid expressions, hollow eyes, gaping mouths, exaggerated features designed to look disturbing even by candlelight. The whole point was to create something frightening. These carved turnips would be hollowed out, a candle placed inside to illuminate the carved face, and then positioned outside homes or carried through the darkness. The flickering candlelight made the faces appear to move, adding to the unsettling effect. The protective function worked two ways, depending on which folk tradition you followed. Some believed the grotesque carved face mimicked frightening supernatural entities, essentially using camouflage make your house look already occupied by something terrifying, and maybe the actual terrifying things would move along to easier targets. If a wandering, malevolent spirit saw a demonic face glowing in your window, perhaps it would assume the territory was claimed and look elsewhere for victims. The other interpretation was that the carved lantern acted as a beacon or signaler, warning that said something dangerous lives here, stay away. Either way, the carved turnip was spiritual defense infrastructure, not holiday decoration. There was also a practical component. Metal lanterns were expensive, far beyond what most rural families could afford. Fire was essential for survival light, heat, cooking but controlling fire. Carrying it safely, transporting it between locations required tools. Hollowed vegetables with candles inside were the poor person's lantern. Free materials, functional light source, serves double duty as supernatural protection. Efficient. But the name jack-o'-lantern doesn't come from the practice of carving vegetables. It comes from a specific legend about a specific person whose afterlife situation was so cosmically messed up that he became the symbol for eternal wandering and damnation. His name was Jack, and the stories say he was, in the most literal sense, a stingy, drunken bastard. The legend of Stingy Jack varies by region and telling, but the core narrative remains consistent across Ireland and Britain. Jack was a blacksmith, or farmer accounts differ, but universally described as a drunkard, a trickster, a cheat, and someone who lived a comprehensively wicked life. Not evil in the sense of murdering innocents or burning villages. More like constantly drunk, perpetually scheming, reliably dishonest, thoroughly unpleasant to be around. Jack was clever, though, cunning enough to be dangerous, and one night, according to the legend, he encountered the devil himself. The devil, apparently, had come to claim Jack's soul. The timing made sense. Jack had lived wickedly enough to merit hell, and his time was apparently up. But Jack, being Jack, wasn't ready to accept damnation without trying something clever first. So Jack convinced the devil to have one last drink with him before they departed for hell. The devil, perhaps curious about this boldness, or just wanting to torment Jack a bit more, agreed. They went to a pub, they drank, and when the bill came, Jack turned to the devil and said something along the lines of, "You're the Prince of Darkness. You can surely turn yourself into a coin to pay for these drinks." The devil, either amused or wanting to demonstrate his power, transformed into a silver coin. Jack immediately grabbed the coin and stuffed it into his pocket-where he kept a silver cross. Now, folklore holds that Christian symbols like crosses have power over demonic entities. The devil, trapped in coin form in Jack's pocket with a cross, was stuck, powerless, imprisoned by his own demonstration of supernatural ability and Jack's quick thinking. Jack made a deal. He'd release the devil, but only if the devil promised not to claim Jack's soul for 10 years. The devil, furious but trapped, agreed. Jack released him. The devil vanished, presumably to go torment people who weren't quite so clever. 10 years passed. Jack continued his drunken, wicked ways, learning absolutely nothing from his supernatural encounter. And right on schedule, the devil returned to claim his soul. But Jack had one more trick. He convinced the devil to climb a tree accounts. Very unwise. Some versions say to pick fruit. Others say Jack challenged the devil's climbing ability. Others suggest Jack claimed there was something the devil needed to see at the top. Regardless, the devil climbed the tree, and Jack immediately carved crosses into the tree trunk, trapping the devil in the branches. Again, Jack negotiated. "Release me," he told the devil, "and promise you'll never take my soul. Ever. Not in 10 years, not in 100 years, not in eternity. Leave me alone forever." The devil, stuck in a tree, surrounded by Christian symbols, and utterly humiliated by being outsmarted twice by the same drunken human, agreed. He promised never to claim Jack's soul. Jack removed the crosses. The devil fled, this time permanently. Jack probably thought he'd won. He'd tricked the devil twice. He'd secured a promise that hell would never claim him. He could live wickedly without consequence, die peacefully, and presumably everything would work out somehow. It did not work out. Jack eventually died accounts. Don't specify how, but given his drinking and lifestyle, natural causes seems unlikely. And when he died, he approached the gates of heaven. God took one look at Jack's life, the drinking, the cheating, the wickedness, the deliberate sin without repentance, and refused him entry. Heaven had standards. Jack didn't meet them. Go away. So Jack, rejected by heaven, descended to hell. He knocked on hell's gates. The devil answered, and Jack presumably expected admission, because where else was he supposed to go? But the devil reminded him of their deal. "I promised never to take your soul. I keep my promises. You can't enter hell." The devil then refused Jack Entrenot out of mercy. But because the bargain was binding, the devil had sworn never to claim Jack's soul, and demonic promises, apparently, are taken seriously. Jack was stuck, barred from heaven for his wickedness, barred from hell by his own cleverness, condemned to wander the earth for eternity, neither alive nor properly dead, with nowhere to go and no rest available. Jack complained that he couldn't see in the darkness. How was he supposed to wander eternity without light? The devil, perhaps feeling some mixture of pity and mockery, tossed Jack a single burning coal from the fires of hell. Just one. A tiny ember of infernal flame to light his way through eternal wandering. Jack caught the coal. Then, looking around for something to carry it in, he carved out a turnipy, 'cause that's what you had in Irish autumn, and placed the burning coal inside. The carved turnip became a lantern, providing just enough light to see by, as Jack began his eternal, aimless wandering across the earth. Jack at the lantern, Jack-o'-lantern, Jack-o'-lantern. The legend positions Jack as a cautionary tale about excessive cleverness, wickedness without repentance, and the danger of trying to outsmart cosmic forces. But it also creates a specific archetype, the wandering damned spirit, neither properly alive nor properly dead, carrying a light through eternal darkness. And that archetype became the symbol carved into protective turnips. When Irish families carved grotesque faces into turnips and placed candles inside, They were creating representations of Jack the perpetually wandering, eternally damned spirit, whose light cuts through supernatural darkness. The carved lantern served as both warning and sympathetic magic. Warning to other spirits. This territory is marked by something already damned and wandering. Sympathetic magic, by displaying the symbol of eternal wandering. Perhaps you'd ward off becoming a wandering spirit yourself. The imagery is dark when you think about it. Your Halloween decoration represents a man too wicked for heaven and too clever for hell, condemned to perpetual isolation with only a burning coal for companionship. That's not festive. That's existential horror. But it worked as protection, or at least people believed it did, which amounts to the same thing in folk practice. The tradition continued through centuries, surviving Christian conversion, social changes, and migration. When Irish and Scottish immigrants arrived in North America in massive numbers during the 19th century, during the Great Famine of the 1840s, when over 1 million Irish people fled starvation and disease, they brought the jack-o'-lantern tradition with them. And they discovered something wonderful. America had pumpkins. Pumpkins are native to North America. Indigenous peoples had been cultivating them for thousands of years.
Okay.
European colonists adopted them quickly because they grew abundantly, stored well, and were incredibly versatile. By the 19th century, pumpkins were everywhere in America common. Cheap, huge compared to turnips, and critically, much easier to carve. Irish immigrants, confronted with the miserable task of carving dense turnips when these massive, soft-fleshed orange gourds were readily available, made the obvious switch. Pumpkins were larger, allowing for more elaborate carvings. They were easier to hollow out. You could scoop out the interior with your hands. They were brighter when lit from inside, making the carved faces more visible. And they were plentiful enough that carving one wasn't a significant investment of resources. The tradition transferred seamlessly. The protective function remained ward off spirits, mark your home as protected, display the symbol of wandering damnation. But now it was bigger, brighter, easier, and distinctly American. The symbolism persisted even as the form changed. Whether turnip or pumpkin, the jack-o'-lantern represented the same thing, a light in the darkness. Literalia, candle flame, illuminating carved features, but also metaphorically human persistence against supernatural threat. The attempt to see clearly when the veil is thin and danger lurks. Jack's eternal wandering with his coal-lit turnip became American families' seasonal ritual. Carve the pumpkin, light the candle, place it where it's visible. The gesture connects directly to Iron Age bonfires, warding off Samhain spirits, medieval Christians carrying candles to guide ancestral souls, and Irish villagers carving turnips to protect against the Eos Sur. Same impulse across millennia. Light against darkness, visibility against threat, human defiance against supernatural chaos. The jack-o'-lantern is arguably Halloween's most recognizable symbol. More than costumes, more than candy, the carved pumpkin announces the holiday, and it carries the entire history embedded in its design. Celtic protective rituals, Christian or Hallowtide observations, Irish folklore, American agricultural abundance, and the ongoing human need to mark territory against forces we fear but cannot control. When you carve a pumpkin this October, you're participating in a tradition that spans 3,000 years and multiple continents. You're echoing Iron Age rituals, medieval practices, and Irish immigrant customs. You're displaying a symbol of eternal damnation as protection. You're lighting a candle to ward off darkness, both physical and spiritual. You're honoring Stingy Jack, that wicked, clever drunk who outsmarted the devil twice and condemned himself to eternal wandering in the process. And whether you know it or not, you're engaging in the same protective magic your ancestors used. Make light, make it visible, make it frightening. And hope that whatever else is wandering in the darkness passes your home by. The jack-o'-lantern represents humanity's oldest Halloween strategy. If you can't fight the darkness, at least carry a light through it. Even if that light is held by someone hell itself rejected. Halloween crossed the Atlantic with Irish and Scottish immigrants, carrying centuries of accumulated tradition, the Celtic terror of Samhain, Christian theological overlay, medieval death imagery, souling and guising customs, and carved turnip lanterns. All of that survived the journey. But when those traditions landed in rapidly urbanizing, economically stressed early 20th century America, something changed. Halloween got violent. Not supernatural violence, not ritualized sacrifice or cosmic accountability. Actual, documented, police report generating property destruction that nearly got the holiday cancelled permanently. Let's start with the early American version before things escalated to crisis levels. By the early 19th century, Irish and Scottish immigrants had successfully transplanted their Halloween customs to North America. Communities, particularly in areas with heavy Celtic immigration, began celebrating Halloween as a recognized observance. The traditions were familiar costumes, divination games, parties, storytelling about ghosts and spirits, and yes, door-to-door guising, where young people would perform tricks or songs in exchange for treats. But alongside the innocent customs came something else. Mischief Night. Mischief Night, also called Devil's Night, Gate Night, or Cabbage Night, depending on region, was a tradition of harmless pranks conducted on or around Halloween. The pranks were relatively benign by modern standards. Young people would soap windows, making them temporarily opaque. They'd unhinge gates and leave them in odd locations. They'd rearrange farm equipment. They'd knock on doors and run away. They'd set off firecrackers. They'd hide in shadows and jump out to scare passers-by. The pranks were annoying but largely reversible. Soap washes off. Gates can be rehung. Moved equipment can be moved back. Nobody was getting hurt. Nothing was permanently damaged. It was mischief, the kind of low-stakes rebellion that let young people blow off steam and test social boundaries without causing real harm. Communities tolerated it because it was contained, predictable, and temporary. One night of minor chaos, then back to normal. Think of it as a pressure release valve for adolescent energy and social tension. But tolerance requires social cohesion, stable communities, and general prosperity. When those conditions disappeared, so did the tolerance. Enter the 1920s and 1930s. America was urbanizing rapidly. Rural populations were moving to cities, seeking industrial jobs. Immigration was high. Communities were less stable, less cohesive, more anonymous. You didn't necessarily know your neighbors anymore. Social bonds that once contained mischief were weakening. Then came the Great Depression. The stock market crashed in 1929. Banks failed. Unemployment skyrocketed at the Depression's peak. Roughly 25% of American workers were unemployed. Poverty was widespread and visible. families lost homes, children went hungry, the social safety net was virtually non-existent. Desperation was a daily reality for millions. And in this context of economic collapse, social stress, and widespread desperation, Halloween mischief stopped being harmless. It escalated dramatically. What had been window soaping became window smashing. What had been gate moving became property destruction. What had been harmless pranks became serious vandalism, theft, and occasionally violence. Halloween transformed from a night of controlled mischief into a night of genuine mayhem that cities struggled to contain. The media coverage shifted to reflect this new reality. Newspapers stopped describing Halloween pranksters as mischievous youth and started calling them gangsters. The language of theft and criminality replaced the language of harmless fun. Articles described young people demanding edible plunder as if trick-or-treating had become a form of organized crime. And here's the thing, the association with actual organized crime wasn't entirely metaphorical. The 1930s were the height of the gangster era. Al Capone, bank robberies, Prohibition-era violence, Tommy guns, organized criminal enterprises. Crime was highly visible in American consciousness. So when newspapers described Halloween vandals as gangsters, they were deliberately connecting relatively minor property damage to the most threatening criminal elements of society. The actual incidents ranged from annoying to genuinely destructive. In 1934, in Helena, Montana, a group of teenagers knocked on a woman's door demanding treats. She refused. According to police reports, the teenagers responded by smashing her concrete bird bath knot, tipping it over, smashing it, destroying several dollars worth of property as retaliation for not receiving candy. That's not a prank. That's destruction of property in response to being told no. That's using Halloween as cover for minor crime. But Helena was mild compared to larger cities. In 1938, Des Moines, Iowa, would later become crucial to Halloween's survival. Police responded to 550 reports of vandalism in a single night. 550. In one city, in one evening. The documented destruction included soaping windows still, the most common complaint, annoying but not particularly harmful. But it also included far more serious offenses, sidelining streetcars by manipulating the tracks, effectively disrupting public transportation, setting fires, which in urban areas with wooden structures posed genuine danger, throwing bricks through windows, which could injure people and caused expensive damage, overturning outhouses, a classic rural prank, but in urban areas this meant property damage and sanitation issues. Other cities reported similar patterns: overturned vehicles, destroyed fences, vandalized storefronts, harassment of pedestrians. In some cases, physical assault. The trick part of trick-or-treat had transformed from voluntary performance into threat. Give us treats or we'll destroy your property. This wasn't cultural tradition anymore. This was civil disorder with an annual schedule. Cities responded with increasing alarm. Police presence was increased on Halloween night. Curfews were discussed. Communities organized adult patrols to watch for vandals. Some municipalities debated banning Halloween entirely, just canceling the holiday, prohibiting any Halloween-related activities, and hoping the problem would disappear. And here's what makes this period fascinating from a historical perspective. Halloween almost died. I'm not from religious suppression or cultural change.
Okay.
But from being too successful at its original function, creating one night when normal rules didn't apply, when chaos was permitted, when social order temporarily broke down. The Depression-era youth took that permission and ran with it. They used Halloween as license for property destruction, economic retaliation, and social rebellion. The holiday became an annual outlet for expressing frustration, anger, and powerlessness in a society that offered them little hope. Think about the psychology. You're a teenager in 1935. Your family lost everything in the crash. Your father is unemployed. Your mother is stretching every penny. You've dropped out of school to look for work that doesn't exist. The future looks bleak. The system has failed you comprehensively. And then Halloween comes one night, when rules are suspended, when mischief is expected, when you can act out without normal consequences. Of course, it escalated. The vandalism wasn't just about Halloween. It was about desperation, frustration, and powerlessness finding an outlet. But that explanation didn't comfort homeowners whose windows were smashed, or businesses whose storefronts were vandalized. Halloween had become a genuine public safety problem and an economic burden. Insurance claims spiked every November. Property owners faced annual repair costs. Cities spent resources on increased police presence. Something had to change. Interestingly, Halloween wasn't the only holiday experiencing this kind of problem. Thanksgiving had a similar custom called ragamuffin parades or Thanksgiving masking, where children, often from poor families, would dress in ragged costumes and go door to door begging for treats or money. The practice had its roots in similar economic desperation. Poor children used costumed begging as a survival strategy, and Thanksgiving provided cultural cover for it. But by the 1930s, ragamuffin parades had also become associated with vandalism, harassment, and disorder. The difference? Ragamuffin parades were successfully eliminated. How? Through a combination of adult disapproval, civic alternatives, and social pressure. Community organizations provided alternative activities, organized parades, festivals, indoor events that gave children something to do while keeping them supervised and controlled. Adults simply refused to participate in the door-to-door begging custom, making it ineffective. And importantly, there was no deep cultural attachment to ragamuffin parades. They were a relatively recent urban phenomenon without centuries of tradition behind them. Halloween was different. Halloween had roots, deep roots, going back thousands of years through multiple cultural layers. You couldn't just eliminate it through disapproval. The holiday had survived Celtic paganism, Roman conquest, Christian conversion, medieval theology, immigration, and secularization. It wasn't going to die quietly from municipal disapproval, but it needed to change. The question was how to preserve the holiday while eliminating the mayhem. The solution came from civic leaders who recognized that you couldn't just ban behavior, you had to replace it with acceptable alternatives. You had to channel the energy, redirect the impulse, and give people a way to participate in Halloween that didn't involve property destruction. You had to domesticate Halloween, tame it, transform it from a night of actual chaos into a night of controlled, supervised, carefully managed simulation of chaos. And the model for doing it, the innovation that would save Halloween and create the modern trick-or-treat system, was pioneered in the same city that had experienced 550 vandalism reports in one night. Des Moines, Iowa was about to invent the future of Halloween. Through deliberate social engineering, propaganda, and the strategic deployment of adult supervision and candy. The civic leaders of Des Moines looked at the mayhem, looked at the ragamuffin parade elimination, and realized Halloween survival depends on transforming property-destroying gangsters into supervised, candy-collecting performers. And they had a plan. Modern trick-or-treating feels natural, like it's always existed. Kids in costumes, neighborhood walks, knocking on doors, receiving candy. Simple, innocent, traditional, except it's not traditional, it's engineered. The modern trick-or-treat system, the one where children go door to door, supervised by adults, politely request candy and receive it without threat or performance. Recalment was deliberately invented by civic authorities in the late 1930s as a behavior modification program designed to save Halloween by eliminating its chaos. This wasn't organic cultural evolution. This was social control through strategic redirection of destructive impulses. And it worked so well that we've completely forgotten it was ever controversial. By the mid-1930s, Halloween had become a municipal crisis. Cities were spending significant resources on increased police presence. Property owners faced annual repair costs. Insurance companies were raising rates. Parents were simultaneously complaining about vandalism affecting their property and struggling to control their own children's participation in it. The holiday was teetering on the edge of outright banning in multiple cities. Community leaders recognized the problem. Halloween couldn't be eliminated, but it couldn't continue in its current form. The solution required finding a way to preserve the holiday while channeling the destructive behavior into something manageable, acceptable, and ideally profitable for local businesses. The key insight was understanding what drove the mayhem. It wasn't pure malice. It was a combination of factors. First, economic desperation. Depressiera families were struggling. Children saw trick-or-treating as a rare opportunity to get treats they couldn't otherwise afford. When denied, the rejection stung more than it would in prosperous times. Vandalism became retaliation for economic exclusion. Second, adolescent energy and rebellion. Teenagers needed outlets for testing boundaries and asserting independence. Halloween provided culturally sanctioned permission for mischief. Without supervision or alternatives, that mischief escalated. Third, the erosion of community accountability. In smaller rural communities, everyone knew everyone. Mischief was contained by social relationships. You didn't destroy your neighbor's property because you'd face consequences from people you knew. But in urbanizing, anonymous cities, that accountability disappeared. You could vandalize a stranger's property without social cost. Fourth, the absence of acceptable alternatives. There was nothing else to do on Halloween except participate in the chaos or stay home. The solution had to address all these factors simultaneously. And Des Moines, Iowa, same city that had experienced 550 vandalism. Reports in 1938 pioneered the model. The Playground Commission of Des Moines instituted Beggars' Night on October 30th, 1938. The name is telling. Not Halloween, not trick-or-treat night. Beggars' Night explicitly acknowledging the economic transaction while reframing it as acceptable. Organized begging rather than extortion or theft. The program had specific rules designed to modify behavior. First, participation required adult supervision. Children couldn't roam freely in anonymous groups. They had to be accompanied by parents or responsible adults who could control behavior and provide accountability. Second, participants were required to perform an approved trick in exchange for treats. This repurposed the old guising tradition. You had to demonstrate a skill, tell a joke, recite a poem, sing a song, or do a brief stunt. The performance transformed the exchange from demand to transaction. You earned the treat through voluntary display of talent. Third, the activities were scheduled and contained. Beggars' Night happened on a specific date during specific hours within specific neighborhoods. This prevented the all-night, citywide chaos that had characterized previous Halloweens. Fourth, community organizations provided alternative supervised activities for children who weren't trick-or-treating parties. Games, contests. The goal was ensuring every child had something to do that didn't involve vandalism. The results were dramatic and immediate. Police reports of mischief and vandalism in Des Moines dropped by roughly 50% by the mid-1940s. The model was successful enough that other cities began adopting variations of it. The Playground Commission and other civic organizations actively promoted the program, published guides for other municipalities, and positioned Beggars' Night as the solution to the Halloween crisis. But World War II provided an even more powerful tool for behavior modification: patriotic propaganda. In 1942, with America fully committed to the war effort, Beggars' Night promoters in Des Moines used nationalistic sentiment to discourage pranks. The headline read, "Kids, don't help the Axis on Halloween." Think about that framing. Halloween vandalism wasn't just destructive, it was unpatriotic. It wasted resources needed for the war effort. It disrupted communities when unity was essential. It distracted police and emergency services from more important duties. Participating in Halloween mayhem meant literally helping the enemy. The message was clear: good American children participate in supervised, controlled trick-or-treating. Bad children, the ones who vandalize, are helping Hitler and Hirohito. This wasn't subtle. This was weaponized nationalism deployed against adolescent mischief, and it was devastatingly effective. The war effort provided cover for massive social engineering. Rationing was already controlling consumption. Civil defense required cooperation and community organization. The government was already asking citizens to modify behavior for national security. Halloween behavior modification fit perfectly into that framework. By the late 1940s, as World War II ended and American prosperity began to return, the new Halloween model had been established. The supervised, treat-focused, performance-optional version of trick-or-treating became standard. The vandalism-focused, chaos-driven, earlier version was increasingly seen as unacceptable, dangerous, and vaguely unpatriotic. The transformation was complete. Halloween had been domesticated. But domestication required one more critical element: commercial support. The candy industry recognized an opportunity. Before the 1940s, Halloween treats were homemade cookies, popcorn balls, candied apples, small toys, coins. Households gave what they had available, which meant variety but also unpredictability and labor. Making enough treats for dozens of trick-or-treaters was time-consuming and expensive. Commercial candy solved that problem. Pre-wrapped, individually portioned, shelf-stable, cheap when bought in bulk. candy companies began marketing specifically for Halloween, positioning their products as the convenient, affordable solution for households expecting trick-or-treaters. By the 1950s, candy had become the default Halloween treat, cementing the holiday as a commercial opportunity. The economic transaction shifted. Instead of children trading performance for homemade treats, they traded brief interaction for mass-produced candy. Instead of households investing labor in preparation, they invested money in bulk candy purchases. The spiritual economy of medieval solemn prayers for soul cakes became the consumer economy of modern Halloween pennies per child for neighborhood goodwill and avoiding property damage. The costumes underwent a parallel transformation. During the Depression and earlier, Halloween costumes were homemade, often frightening, and sometimes genuinely disturbing. People created disguises meant to hide identity or evoke supernatural threat, the original Celtic function of spiritual camouflage. But as Halloween became family-oriented and commercially driven, the costumes shifted toward mass-produced, recognizable, and marketable characters. Department stores began selling boxed costumes featuring licensed characters: Mickey Mouse, cowboys, princesses, superheroes. Costumes moved from terrifying disguise to hide from death to cute outfit to display character affinity. This shift was both cause and effect of Halloween's domestication. Cute costumes signaled that Halloween was no longer about actual supernatural threat or social rebellion. It was about children participating in supervised community activity while parents demonstrated their ability to provide for their children through costume purchases. The commercialization of costumes also served a social control function. Boxed costumes were expensive, creating class distinctions. Wealthier families could afford better costumes, signaling status. Poorer families had to make do with homemade or cheaper options. Halloween became another arena for performing social class, further integrating it into mainstream American consumer culture. By the 1950s, the transformation was complete. Halloween had evolved from Celtic festival of supernatural survival, gives Christian observation of the dead, gives medieval death obsession, gives Irish folk customs, gives American vandalism, crisis, gives supervised commercial holiday. The modern version preserved elements of each layer while stripping away the genuine terror, theological weight, and social chaos. What remained was a safely contained, commercially profitable, family-friendly simulation of chaos. Children still wore costumes, but the costumes represented media characters rather than spiritual camouflage. Children still went door to door, but under supervision rather than as anonymous vandals. Children still received treats, but as consumer transaction rather than spiritual or performance exchange. The holiday still happened on October 31st, but the date's significance as the night when the veil thinned had been reduced to decorative theme. The domestication of Halloween reveals something crucial about how societies manage cultural practices that threaten social order. You don't ban them. That creates martyrdom and resistance. You don't eliminate them. That removes the pressure valve they provide. Instead, you channel them. You maintain the form while changing the function. You preserve the tradition while eliminating the threat. Halloween survived because civic authorities figured out how to make it safe, profitable, and aligned with mainstream values. The cost of survival was neutering the holiday's genuine connection to death, chaos, and supernatural fear. The benefit was ensuring that future generations could participate in Halloween without risking arrest or property damage. Modern trick-or-treating is the product of that bargain. It's controlled chaos, supervised rebellion, commercialized tradition. It allows children to temporarily step outside normal rules, staying up late, demanding treats from strangers, wearing unusual clothing, while ensuring that the transgression remains contained, predictable, and profitable. The irony is that we've forgotten the engineering. Most people assume trick-or-treating is an ancient tradition, not a 1940s civic innovation. We've naturalized the behavior modification program so successfully that it feels inevitable. But it wasn't. It was a choice, a strategic intervention by community leaders facing a genuine crisis. They looked at Halloween's chaos and recognized that the holodeck could either be eliminated or transformed, and transformation was more feasible. So they transformed it through adult supervision, through performance requirements that were eventually made optional, through propaganda linking good behavior to patriotism, through commercial partnerships that made participation convenient and profitable, through costume commercialization that integrated Halloween into consumer culture. They saved Halloween by making it safe, and in doing so, they created the version we know today, a holiday that maintains the form of ancient death rituals while serving primarily as commercial opportunity and community building exercise. The vandalism era is almost forgotten now, reduced to cautionary tales or historical footnotes. But it was real, widespread, and dangerous enough to nearly kill the holiday. The fact that Halloween survived is testament to effective social engineering. The fact that we've forgotten it was engineered is testament to how effectively the engineering worked. But domestication and commercialization weren't the end of Halloween's evolution. The holiday was about to encounter new forces that would reshape it again. The rise of haunted attractions, the explosion of slasher films, and the transformation of fear itself into a purchasable commodity. Halloween was safe now, controlled, family-friendly. That was about to change. Because America was about to industrialize terror itself and sell it back to consumers as entertainment. The bogs had bodies. The medieval period had death art. The Depression had vandalism. The late 20th century would have something different. The deliberate commercial construction of environments designed purely to terrorize people who paid for the privilege. Welcome to the haunted house industry. Once Halloween had been domesticated, transformed from vandalism, crisis into supervised candy distribution, you'd think the holiday would lose its edge entirely. No more ritual sacrifice, no more theological terror, no more property destruction, just kids in cute costumes collecting treats. But humanity's relationship with fear is more complicated than that. Okay, we need it, not actual danger, but simulated threat, controlled terror, the sensation of confronting death without the risk of actually dying. Enter the haunted house industry, the deliberate, commercial construction of environments designed to terrify paying customers. This is Halloween's final transformation, from survival necessity to consumer product, fear as entertainment, death as attraction, terror you can purchase by the ticket. And this industry didn't emerge from nowhere. It has roots stretching back through Victorian spiritualism, Gothic literature, and that persistent human need to peek beyond the veil, now sanitized, commercialized, and available at multiple price points. Let's start with the cultural foundations. The concept of haunted places predates recorded history. Every culture has locations believed to be inhabited by spirits, demons, or supernatural entities. Burial grounds, battlefields, sites of tragedy or violence, places where the boundary between living and dead feels thin. These weren't attractions. These were places people avoided, feared, treated with caution or reverence. But the Victorian era, roughly 1830s to early 1900s, transformed the relationship with haunted spaces. This was the period of Gothic literature, ghost stories, and widespread fascination with death and the supernatural. Authors like Edgar Allan Poe, Mary Shelley, and later Bram Stoker created narratives where haunted locations became settings for entertainment rather than pure terror. Gothic literature gave audiences permission to enjoy fear. The stories provided safe distance you could experience supernatural threat through fiction while remaining physically secure. The sensation of fear became pleasurable when separated from actual danger. This is crucial for understanding haunted attractions. They rely on the audience knowing consciously that the threat isn't real, even while the body responds as if it were. Simultaneously, Victorian culture developed an obsession with spiritualism, the belief that the living could communicate with the dead through mediums, seances, and various paranormal technologies. Spiritualism exploded in popularity during the mid to late 19th century, particularly in America and Britain. People attended seances, hoping to contact deceased relatives. Mediums held public demonstrations of their supposed abilities to channel spirits. Entire belief systems developed around the possibility of verifiable contact with the afterlife. And here's where it gets relevant to haunted attractions. Spiritualism required spectacle. 8. Mediums used theatrical techniques to create convincing supernatural experiences. Darkened rooms, strategic lighting, hidden assistants, mechanical tricks, sound effects. The goal was making participants feel they'd genuinely encountered the supernatural, even when the experience was manufactured. These seances were, functionally, the first haunted attractions. People paid money to enter a controlled environment where they'd experience simulated supernatural phenomena. The medium created an atmosphere of fear and uncertainty, used tricks to produce evidence of spirits, and left participants with a memorable, emotionally intense experience. Some seances were fraudulent, exposed as tricks by skeptics like Harry Houdini. Others were genuine attempts by believers to contact the dead. But regardless of intent, they established a template. Create an environment, manipulate atmosphere, produce fear or wonder, charge admission. By the early 20th century, traveling carnivals and fairs had adopted similar techniques. Ghost shows became popular attractions. Traveling entertainers would set up in darkened tents or buildings, use projections, sound effects, and planted actors to create spooky experiences. These weren't sophisticated by modern standards, maybe some glowing paint, some hidden speakers, strategically placed mirrors, but they were effective enough to draw crowds and generate revenue. The Great Depression accelerated this evolution. With widespread economic hardship, communities needed fundraising mechanisms. Haunted houses emerged as a practical solution. Local organizations, civic groups, churches, schools, charity organizations would create simple, haunted attractions in available spaces. empty buildings, church basements, school gymnasiums, any location that could be made dark and filled with hidden actors. These Depression-era haunted houses were rudimentary. Dark corridors. Volunteers hiding in corners to jump out and scare visitors. Simple costume sheets to simulate ghosts, basic masks, whatever could be improvised. The special effects were minimal, maybe some colored lighting, hanging fabric to brush against faces, sound effects created by volunteers. Nothing elaborate, nothing expensive, just darkness, anticipation, and people trying to startle you. But they worked. Haunted houses drew crowds, generated donations, and provided entertainment during a period when entertainment was scarce and expensive. The format proved sustainable because the overhead was minimal and the appeal was broad. People would pay small amounts for the experience, and volunteers would donate time because it served community or charitable purposes. Through the mid-20th century, haunted houses remained largely amateur operations. They appeared seasonally, usually in October, staffed by volunteers focused on simple scares. The themes were predictably classical horror characters like Dracula, Frankenstein's monster, werewolves, mummies, witches. These were the monsters everyone recognized from Universal Studios films of the 1930s and 1940s. The haunted house experience was formulaic. Walk through darkness, encounter monsters, get startled, exit. This changed dramatically in the late 20th century. Multiple forces converged to transform haunted houses from amateur fundraisers to professional, sophisticated, multi-million-dollar operations. First, technology improved. The late 20th century brought better lighting, sound systems, animatronics, theatrical fog machines, and other tools that could create far more convincing and intense environments. What had been a person in a sheet could now be a mechanized figure that moved realistically, made sound, and triggered on senses. Second, horror cinema evolved. The 1970s and 1980s brought a new wave of extreme horror films with explicit gore, psychological terror, and graphic violence. These films, The Exorcist, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Halloween, Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street created new icons of fear and established visual languages for modern horror. Haunted houses could now reference these films, using familiar villains and scenarios that audiences recognized and responded to. Third, theme parks demonstrated that elaborate, immersive attractions could be profitable. Disney proved you could charge significant admission for manufactured experiences. Universal Studios and other parks showed that horror-themed attractions could draw massive crowds. The economic model was validated. People would pay substantial money for well-executed entertainment experiences. Fourth, entrepreneurship entered the industry. What had been community fundraisers became commercial businesses. Professional haunt designers emerged, specializing in creating terror environments. The haunt vendor industry developed companies manufacturing props, animatronics, costumes, and effects specifically for haunted attractions. Halloween became a legitimate business sector. The transformation accelerated in the 1980s and 1990s. Haunted houses went from black plastic and some bloody walls to elaborate, multi-room experiences with narrative through lines, professional actors, sophisticated effects, and production values rivaling theatre or film. Key innovations drove this evolution. The introduction of mechanized props like the Distortion's unlimited electric chair, which simulated electrocution with lighting, sound, and actor performance, showed that technology could amplify scares beyond what human actors alone could achieve. Air-driven pneumatic props allowed figures to lunge at visitors with startling speed and force. Sophisticated makeup and costuming transformed actors into convincing monsters. Sound design created immersive audio environments that maintained tension even between scare moments. The industry discovered something crucial. You could engineer fear. Not just create startling moments, but design entire experiences that manipulated emotional states, built anticipation, delivered payoffs, and left customers satisfied enough to return and recommend the experience. Modern professional haunted attractions use psychological principles deliberately. They control pacing, alternating high-intensity scares with low-attention transition spaces to prevent emotional exhaustion. They manipulate sensory input darkness, disorienting sounds, unexpected physical sensations like air blasts or texture changes. They exploit common fear-state spaces, heights, darkness, loss of control. They use narrative framing to give context that makes scares more meaningful than random startling. The economics scaled accordingly. Amateur haunted houses charged maybe $1 or $2 for admission. Modern professional attractions charge $30 to $60 or more. High-end experiences can cost over $100 per person. The industry generates billions in annual revenue across thousands of attractions worldwide. And here's what makes this relevant to Halloween's evolution. Haunted houses democratized the experience of confronting death and supernatural terror. In Iron Age Celtic culture, confronting supernatural terror on Samhain was about survival. You participated in rituals because failure meant potentially fatal consequences. In medieval Christianity, confronting death was about salvation. You contemplated mortality because your eternal fate depended on spiritual preparation. In both cases, the fear was real, the stakes were infinite, and participation was essentially mandatory. Modern haunted houses flip that entirely. The fear is simulated. The stakes are zero. You can leave whenever you want, and nothing bad actually happens. Participation is voluntary. You actively choose to pay money for the experience. The terror is recreational, controlled, safe. This represents a fundamental shift in humanity's relationship with death and fear. We've moved from experiencing fear as existential threat to consuming fear as entertainment commodity. The same themes that once kept Celtic communities awake with genuine terror death, the supernatural, malevolent entities, loss of control are now packaged and sold as Halloween attractions. The haunted house is medieval donks macabre made interactive. It's the visceral experience of mortality and decay that prayer books once illustrated, now presented as something you walk through for fun. It's the Samhain terror of malevolent spirits crossing the veil, transformed into actors in masks, jumping out of darkness. Same imagery, same themes. Same core anxieties about death, chaos, and the unknown. Completely different contexts and purpose. The industry explicitly markets this transformation. Haunted house advertising emphasizes how scary, how extreme, how intense the experience will be, but always with the implicit promise that it's ultimately safe. You'll be terrified, but you won't actually be harmed. You'll confront death, but you'll survive. You'll face monsters, but they're actors with mortgages. This is fear commodification at its purest. The industry has successfully isolated the sensation of terror from actual danger, packaged it into a consumer product, and sold it to people who crave the emotional intensity but not the genuine risk. And crucially, this commodification is tied directly to cinematic horror. The villains in haunted houses are often licensed characters from films Jason from Friday the 13th, Freddy from Nightmare on Elm Street, various zombies, clowns, and killers from countless horror movies. The scenarios reference familiar narratives, the aesthetics mirror film imagery. Horror cinema creates the fear vocabulary. Haunted houses translate that vocabulary into physical, interactive experience. The relationship is symbiotic. Films provide source material. Haunted houses provide embodiment. Both reinforce each other's commercial success. This brings us to a crucial realization. Modern Halloween is built on the industrialization of fear. The holiday survived domestication in the 1940s by becoming safe and commercial. It thrived in the late 20th century by making fear itself a consumer product. Halloween transformed from a night when you feared for your survival or salvation into a season when you pay to be scared. The progression is clear. Iron Age terror was involuntary and existential. Medieval terror was theological and inescapable. Modern terror is voluntary and recreational. Same fears death, darkness, chaos, the supernatural. Completely different relationship to those fears. Haunted houses represent Halloween's final transformation from ancient ritual to modern industry. They are physical monuments to humanity's success in domesticating our deepest anxieties. We've taken the terror that once required ritual sacrifice, prayer, and genuine spiritual preparation, and we've turned it into something you can experience for 45 minutes on a Saturday night for the price of a movie ticket. The Celts would be confused. Medieval Christians would be horrified. But Depression-era vandals might understand. You just need to smash something or be scared by something to feel alive. We just figured out how to charge admission for it. Speaking of charging admission for fear, we haven't even gotten to slasher films yet. Because while haunted houses were learning to engineer terror, Hollywood was creating a new pantheon of villains that would define Halloween for generations. Villains so iconic that children would dress up as them. Murderers so culturally embedded that they'd become costume options. Killers so profitable that they'd spawn billion-dollar franchises. Halloween was about to meet Michael Myers and Jason and Freddy. And the holiday would never look the same. By the 1970s, Halloween had been thoroughly domesticated. Supervised trick-or-treating, commercial candy, cute costumes, family-friendly entertainment. The holiday had been successfully neutered, stripped of its genuine terror, and transformed into a consumer-driven community event. And then cinema asked, what if we put the terror back? What if we made Halloween genuinely frightening again? But this time, the fear came from humans instead of spirits. What if the monster wasn't supernatural, it was just a guy with a knife and absolutely no conscience? Welcome to the slasher era, where horror became visceral, explicit, and wildly profitable. Where a new generation of villains emerged to replace the AOS's medieval demons. And Stingy Jack where the costumes on Halloween nights shifted from hiding from monsters to dressing as the monsters themselves. The 1970s horror boom didn't start with splatters. It started with something arguably worse: supernatural horror that took itself deadly seriously. The Exorcist arrived in 1973 and traumatized an entire generation. This wasn't campy monster movie horror. This was a child possessed by a demon, vomiting, masturbating with a crucifix, her head spinning backward, speaking in tongues while her body contorted impossibly. The film depicted graphic, disturbing imagery grounded in Catholic theology, making it feel not just scary but spiritually dangerous. Reports circulated of audience members fainting, vomiting, fleeing theaters. Some theaters hired nurses to attend screenings. The Exorcist made horror feel real again, tapping into genuine religious dread rather than gothic atmosphere. This set the stage for what followed: horror that didn't rely on implication or shadows, horror that showed you everything, horror that violated boundaries of taste, decency, and what audiences thought they could handle. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre dropped in 1974 with a title that told you exactly what to expect: a family of cannibals, a chainsaw-wielding maniac wearing a mask made from human faces, teens being butchered in rural Texas. The film was grainy, grimy, felt documentary real. It looked like footage that shouldn't exist, like you were watching something genuinely illegal. The visceral, unrelenting brutality established a template. Horror could be explicit, could show the violence rather than suggest it, could make audiences genuinely uncomfortable instead of just startled. And then in 1978, a film literally named Halloween created the blueprint for an entire subgenre. John Carpenter's Halloween introduced Michael Myers, a masked killer who had murdered his sister as a child, spent 15 years in a psychiatric institution, and then escaped to return to his hometown on Halloween night to murder teenagers. The film's genius was its simplicity. Michael Myers wasn't supernatural, at least not explicitly. He was just a human who apparently couldn't be killed, didn't speak, showed no emotion, and murdered with mechanical efficiency. He was death personified, stoppable, motiveless, inevitable. The mask became iconic. A white William Shatner mask, modified to remove expression, painted to look blank and inhuman. Michael Myers' face was a void, completely neutral, revealing nothing. He could be anyone. He could be standing behind you right now. The mask made him both specifica, recognizable visual, and universally blank canvas for projecting fear. Halloween the film created Halloween the phenomenon. It grossed over $70 million on a $300,000 budget. It demonstrated that slasher films could be massive commercial successes, and it established October 31st as the perfect setting for horror, the one night when masked figures are expected, when boundaries blur, when normal rules are suspended. Friday the 13th followed in 1980, introducing Jason Voorhees and his hockey mask. A Nightmare on Elm Street arrived in 1984 with Freddy Krueger and his razor-fingered glove. Each film spawned sequels, franchises, merchandising, empires. Each villain became instantly recognizable, each added to a growing pantheon of modern monsters. These weren't the universal monsters of the 1930s and 1940s Dracula, Frankenstein's monster, the Wolfman. Those creatures were sympathetic, often tragic, victims of curses or circumstances. They killed, but reluctantly, or driven by supernatural compulsion beyond their control. Slasher villains were different. They chose violence. They enjoyed it, or at least performed it with such dedication that enjoyment seemed implied. They stalked teenagers, preferably attractive, sexually active teenagers, and murdered them in creative, graphic ways. The films explicitly connected sex and death, punishment and violence. If you had premarital sex, you died. If you used drugs or alcohol, you died. If you strayed from the group, you died. The only survivor was usually the final girl, the virginal, resourceful young woman who fought back and survived. The formula was repetitive, but audiences didn't care. Slasher films exploded in popularity through the 1980s, producing dozens of franchises and hundreds of imitators. The villains became cultural icons, recognized even by people who'd never seen the films. And here's where it intersects with Halloween, the holiday, the costumes. Throughout the 1980s, Halloween costumes shifted dramatically towards specific, recognizable horror villains. Department stores and costume shops began stocking Michael Myers masks, Jason hockey masks, Freddy Krueger gloves, and sweaters. Actual children wanted to dress up as serial killers for Halloween. Think about the symbolism here. For 3,000 years, Halloween costumes served a protective function. Celtic communities wore disguises to hide from malevolent entities. Medieval Christians wore costumes as part of guising performances. Early American Halloween goers wore masks to maintain anonymity during mischief. The costume was defensive. It protected you, hid you, or enabled you. Now children actively chose to embody the threat, to dress as the killer instead of the victim, to become the monster instead of hiding from it. This represents a fundamental psychological shift. The fear had been externalized, transformed into something recognizable and controllable. Michael Myers was terrifying in a theater, but as a costume, he was just a mask you could take off. Jason was a murderer in the films, but at Halloween, he was a character you could play. Freddy was a nightmare demon, but also a commercial property available for $30 at your local costume shop. The commodification of slasher villains allowed children to safely engage with extremely dark material. You could experience the thrill of being the monster without actual violence. You could embody death without dying. You could play at being terrifying without terrorizing anyone who didn't consent to the game. Simultaneously, costumes expanded to include celebrities and pop culture figures who had nothing to do with horror. Madonna, Michael Jackson, Princess Diana, recognizable figures from music. Entertainment and public life became popular costume choices through the 1980s. The costume function shifted from supernatural protection to cultural commentary, from hiding identity to displaying cultural knowledge. Dressing as Madonna wasn't about scaring anyone. It was about participating in pop culture, showing you were current, demonstrating you understood references. Halloween costumes became a form of communication. This is who I admire. This is what I find interesting. This is the character I want to temporarily inhabit. This severed the last connection between Halloween costumes and their original function. Celtic disguises were survival gear against the AOSC. Medieval guising was economic transaction paired with performance. Depression-era masks enabled anonymous mischief. But 1980s pop culture costumes, those were pure expression, entertainment, participation in commercial culture. The shift also meant that masks covering the entire face became less popular. Why hide your face when the point is to be recognized, to show off your costume, to participate in the communal game of reference and recognition? Masks that revealed the wearer's face became standard headpieces. Partial masks, makeup that enhanced features rather than concealing them. This movement, away from full-face concealment, signaled the final abandonment of the ancient belief that you needed to hide your identity from wandering spirits. Nobody seriously believed malevolent entities were crossing the veil on October 31st anymore. The costumes weren't protection. They were costume in the modern theatrical sense. Outfits worn for display, not defense. The slasher villains adopted during this period were deeply symbolic of contemporary American anxieties. Michael Myers represented suburban terror, the killer who emerges from within the community, the neighbor who turns violent, the breakdown of safe domestic space. Jason Voorhees represented wilderness, danger, and revenge nature, striking back, past sins, catching up, the punishment for transgression. Freddy Krueger represented nightmare, invasion, the inability to escape even in sleep, guilt made manifest, psychological trauma embodied. These villains gave form to fears that medieval demons and Celtic spirits no longer captured. Modern Americans didn't fear the AOSCs stealing children or souls burning in purgatory. They feared home invasion, stranger danger, the violence lurking beneath suburban normalcy. Slasher films and the costumes they inspired allowed people to confront those contemporary anxieties in controlled, safe contexts. Halloween became a cultural mirror reflecting the specific fears of each era. By allowing individuals to temporarily embody those fears, to dress as the killer, the monster, the threat, the holiday functioned as collective shadow work. You acknowledged the darkness, gave it form, played with it for a night, and then returned to normal life the next day, having processed something difficult through performance. The slasher boom also reinforced Halloween's commercial dominance. The films were released strategically around Halloween, creating synergy between cinema and holiday. Costume sales spiked, merchandising expanded. Theme parks began creating Halloween-specific attractions featuring licensed slasher villains. The entire cultural commercial ecosystem aligned around Halloween as the premier horror holiday. By the end of the 1980s, Halloween had evolved into something unprecedented. A holiday that celebrated fear as entertainment, that transformed killers into costume options, that made death and violence into playful themes rather than genuine terrors. The Celtic origin survival against supernatural chaos were completely obscured beneath layers of commercialization and media influence. And yet, the core remained. Halloween was still the night when normal rules were suspended. Still the night focused on death, darkness, and the macabre. Still the night when boundaries blurred between child and adult, victim and perpetrator, fear and fun. The form had changed radically, but the function persisted. Halloween provided permission to engage with material that was otherwise taboo. Medieval Christians couldn't casually joke about death, was too spiritually dangerous. Celtic communities couldn't play with supernatural terror, was too existentially threatening. But modern Americans could dress their children as serial killers, decorate with fake corpses, watch horror films featuring graphic violence, and visit haunted houses to be terrorized, all without genuine consequences. The industrialization and commercialization of fear had successfully separated terror from actual danger. Halloween became the annual celebration of that separation, the proof that humanity had conquered our deepest anxieties by transforming them into consumer products. The slasher era didn't create that transformation, but it perfected it. It gave Halloween a new visual language, new icons, new ways to engage with death and violence. It demonstrated that even the darkest material could be made safe, profitable, and appropriate for family consumption with the right commercial framing. Michael Myers, Jason Voorhees, and Freddy Krueger joined the long lineage of Halloween's feared entities. The AOSC, medieval demons, stingy jacks, depreciara, gangsters, now slasher villains all. Threats that Halloween helped society confront, process, and ultimately domesticate. The difference was that nobody had actually believed Michael Myers would cross the veil and murder them. He was always fiction, always entertainment, always controllable through the off switch. The fear he represented was real violence, randomness, suburban breakdown, but the embodiment was safe. Halloween had completed its journey from genuine existential terror to simulated recreational fear. From rituals meant to ensure literal survival to costumes celebrating fictional killers. From bonfires warding off actual supernatural threats to haunted houses where you paid to be chased by actors. The holiday had survived by adapting, transforming, and ultimately commercializing every aspect of what once made it terrifying. And the 1970s and 1980s represented the culmination of that process. The moment when Halloween became fully, unapologetically about consuming fear rather than surviving it. But domestication and commercialization in America didn't mean Halloween would stay contained. The holiday was about to go global, spreading American commercial Halloween culture while encountering and merging with local death traditions around the world. Because if there's one thing more profitable than domesticating fear within one culture, it's exporting that domestication globally and charging admission everywhere. Halloween was about to become an international franchise, with regional variations, local adaptations, and the same underlying truth. Humanity needs a night to confront death, and we're willing to pay for it. By the late 20th century, Halloween had become America's second largest commercial holiday, generating billions in annual revenue through costumes, candy, decorations, and entertainment. It had survived 3,000 years of transformation from Celtic survival ritual to Christian, theological observation to medieval death obsession to American vandalism, crises to domesticated consumer spectacle. And then it started spreading. Not through conquests or religious conversion, the mechanisms that had previously transmitted Halloween's ancestor festivals. This time, it spread through the far more efficient vector of global capitalism and American cultural export. Halloween was going international. Sort of, the spread of American-style Halloween across the globe is uneven, contested, and revealing about how commercial culture intersects with local tradition. Some countries embraced it enthusiastically, seeing it as harmless fun and profitable opportunity. Others resisted it as cultural imperialism, an American import threatening local customs. And in many places, Halloween didn't replace existing traditions, merged with them, creating hybrid observances that combined commercial American elements with indigenous death rituals. Because here's the thing, most cultures have traditions for honoring the dead, marking seasonal transitions or confronting mortality. Halloween isn't unique in its themes. What's unique is how thoroughly it's been commercialized and systematized into a reproducible format that can be exported globally. Let's look at where American Halloween landed and what happened. In Mexico and much of Latin America, the Dia de los Muertos, Day of the Dead, has been observed for centuries, with roots in indigenous Aztec festivals honoring deceased ancestors. Celebrated primarily on November 1st and 2nd, overlapping with Christian All Saints and All Souls Days. Dia de los Muertos involves families creating ofrendas, altars with photographs, favorite foods, and marigolds to welcome ancestral spirits home. Families visit graves, share meals, tell stories about the deceased, and celebrate death as part of life's cycle. The themes overlap significantly with Halloween honoring the dead, acknowledging the supernatural, marking the transition into winter. But the tone is completely different. Dia de los Muertos is celebratory, colorful, familiar, and explicitly about connection with specific deceased relatives. There's no terror, no monsters, no attempt to ward off malevolent entities. When American-style Halloween began appearing in Mexican border cities and tourist areas complete with trick-or-treating, horror themes, and commercial costumes, it created cultural tension. Some saw it as diluting authentic tradition with commercialized American imports. Others, particularly younger generations and businesses, embraced Halloween as additional celebration, something that could coexist with rather than replace Dia de los Muertos. The result in many areas is hybrid observation. Halloween-themed parties and trick-or-treating on October 31st, followed immediately by traditional Dia de los Muertos observances on November 1st and 2nd. The commercial and the traditional, the American and the indigenous, existing simultaneously. In Japan, Halloween arrived primarily through Tokyo Disneyland, which began hosting Halloween events in the 1990s. The holiday exploded in popularity through the 2000s, but with distinctly Japanese characteristics. The focus shifted almost entirely to costumes and public display, with elaborate costume competitions, street parties, and social media documentation. Trick-or-treating never caught Andor Tudor. Interaction with strangers doesn't align with Japanese social norms. The horror elements are present but softened, transformed into cute, scary aesthetics. Japanese Halloween is less about confronting death and more about temporary identity, transformation, and public performance. It's an excuse to wear elaborate costumes, participate in group events, and document the experience for social sharing. The commercial aspects thrived: costume sales, themed products, special events, while the cultural aspects that required changing social behavior like trick-or-treating were largely ignored. In Europe, the response varied dramatically by country and region. Ireland and Scotland, where many Halloween traditions originated, never stopped observing the holiday in various forms. Bonfires, guising, divination. Games. These practices continued in rural areas even as urbanization and modernization changed their contexts. The American commercial version arrived as something familiar but amplified, adding commercial elements to existing traditions rather than importing something entirely foreign. England's relationship with Halloween was more complicated. Guy Fawkes Night, November 5th, occupied similar cultural space. Bonfires, fireworks, autumn celebration, and traditionally overshadowed Halloween. But American cultural influence, particularly through media and commercial pressure, gradually increased Halloween's prominence. By the early 2000s, Halloween had become a significant commercial event in Britain, though with ongoing debate about whether it was displacing authentic British traditions. Continental Europe showed resistance in some areas, particularly where strong Catholic traditions emphasized All Saints' Day and All Souls' Day as solemn religious observances rather than opportunities for commercial celebration. France, for instance, saw significant pushback against Halloween in the early 2000s after a brief period of commercial enthusiasm. Critics characterized it as Anglo-Saxon cultural imperialism, unnecessary Americanization, and commercial exploitation of something that should remain religiously significant. But even with resistance, elements of commercial Halloween penetrated globally. Costume parties became popular even where trick-or-treating didn't. Horror-themed entertainment gained traction. Decorations appeared in retail spaces, the visual language of Halloween pumpkins, skeletons, witches became internationally recognizable even where the full American Halloween experience wasn't adopted. Interestingly, echoes of pre-commercial Halloween traditions persisted in various regions, often unknown to participants that they were engaging with practices thousands of years old. Portugal's P. Apordius bread for good tradition involves children going door to door on November 1st requesting bread, cakes, or sweets while singing traditional songs. The practice directly parallels medieval sowing prayer for food exchange, door-to-door solicitation, connection to honoring the dead. It survived independently of American Halloween influence, demonstrating that the core custom predates and transcends its American commercial form. The Philippines' Pangangalua tradition, observed on All Souls' Day, November 2nd, involves groups going house to house, singing songs, requesting alms for souls in purgatory. Again, this is solely the medieval spiritual economy surviving in Catholic tradition. Completely separate from American Halloween, but functionally identical in structure. These survivals are crucial for understanding Halloween's true nature. The American commercial version didn't invent door-to-door solicitation, costume wearing, or death-themed autumn observation. It commercialized and systematized practices that emerged independently across multiple cultures because they serve fundamental human needs. Every culture confronts death. Every culture marks seasonal transitions. Every culture develops mechanisms for managing anxiety about mortality and chaos. The specific forms vary: Celtic bonfires, Christian prayers, Mexican ofrendas, Japanese ancestor veneration, but the underlying psychological drivers remain constant. What American Halloween accomplished was creating a reproducible, exportable format for engaging with these universal concerns. It stripped away most of the cultural specificity, reduced the genuine terror, eliminated the theological weight, and packaged the remaining themes into something that could be sold globally. Costumes, candy, decorations, entertainment, a designated night for controlled transgression. The adaptability explains both the success and the controversy. Halloween succeeds where it offers something missing from local culture: an outlet for playfulness around death themes, commercial opportunity, or excuse for costume parties. It fails or faces resistance where it conflicts with existing traditions, threatens religious observance, or feels like cultural imperialism. But even where Halloween hasn't been fully adopted, its influence is visible. The imagery proliferates. The commercial model inspires local adaptations. The basic structured, designated time for death-themed entertainment and community interaction proves universally appealing. Which brings us to the enduring archetype at Halloween's core. Despite 3,000 years of transformation, despite radical changes in belief systems and cultural contexts, despite commercialization and domestication, Halloween still engages with the same ancient, universal psychological drivers: the existential fear of the unknown, the mystery of death, and the need to acknowledge ancestors and mortality. The jack-o'-lantern, whether turnip or pumpkin, still functions as a light in the dark, both literally and metaphorically. It represents human persistence against darkness, visibility against threat, defiance against the void. The specific symbolism has changed from warding off the AOSC to representing Stingy Jack to becoming generic decoration. But the core function persists, marking space as human-occupied, creating light against darkness. Costumes still blur the line between human and other, life and death, self and character. The function has shifted from spiritual camouflage to entertainment, but the act of transformation remains central. For one night, you can be something else: monster, hero, ghost, character, anything except your ordinary self. That temporary transcendence of normal identity, that permission to inhabit something different, echoes the original purpose even while serving new functions. The timing persists. October 31st remains special, even for people who have no idea why. The date carries accumulated cultural weight from thousands of years of observation. It feels liminal, transitional, somehow different from other nights, not because the veil actually thins, but because cultural memory and commercial reinforcement have made it feel that way. What has fundamentally changed is how humanity engages with the fear Halloween represents. Ancient Samhain emphasized survival. The Celtic response to supernatural terror was defensive eps. The spirits hide from threats, perform rituals to ensure physical survival through winter. The fear was immediate, existential, and inescapable. You participated in Samhain because the alternative was death, literal or spiritual. Medieval All Hallows focused on repentance. The Christian response to mortality was theological preparation, pray for souls in purgatory. Contemplate your own death, repent sins to ensure salvation. The fear was ultimate rather than immediate, not death itself, but what came after. You participated in All Hallows because your eternal fate depended on spiritual vigilance. Modern Halloween focuses on confrontation. The contemporary response to death is recreational engagement. Visit haunted houses, watch horror films, dress as monsters, consume fear as entertainment. The terror has been externalized, controlled, made safe. You participate in Halloween because it's fun, profitable, socially expected, or all three. The movement is from passive, fatalistic defense to active, recreational consumption. From being terrorized to choosing terror, from survival necessity to consumer choice. This shift marks a profound change in humanity's relationship with death and the supernatural. We no longer believe, or at least most of us no longer believe, that malevolent entities will literally kill us if we don't perform correct rituals. We no longer organize our lives around preparing for judgment and possible eternal damnation. We've secularized, rationalized, and medicalized death to the point where it's largely invisible in daily life. Halloween provides the exception. One night when death becomes visible again, when we grant ourselves permission to engage with material that's otherwise taboo, when we can play with darkness knowing the lights come back on at the end. The holiday endures because that permission, that engagement, remains psychologically necessary. We can't entirely banish death from consciousness. We can't fully rationalize away our anxiety about mortality and the unknown. We need mechanisms for acknowledging, processing, and confronting those fundamental fears. Halloween has survived by continuously adapting to provide that mechanism in forms appropriate to each era. Blood sacrifice for the Iron Age, prayer and morbid art for the medieval period, vandalism for Depression-era rebellion, candy and costumes for post-war prosperity, horror entertainment for contemporary affluence. The methods change with available technology, belief systems, and economic conditions. The need persists across all variations. Halloween is humanity's longest-running attempt to manage the terror of death. It's been refined over 3 millennia, tested across multiple cultures, adapted to countless contexts, and ultimately commercialized into a global phenomenon generating billions in annual revenue. And underneath the commercial veneer, beneath the inflatable lawn decorations and mass-produced costumes, the ancient function persists. On October 31st, the boundary between life and death feels thinner, darkness presses closer, and humanity gathers to light candles, wear masks, tell stories, and remind ourselves that we're still here, still surviving, still capable of laughing at the darkness that once and ultimately still does terrify us. The veil still matters. We've just figured out how to charge admission to peek beyond it. And that, 3,000 years after Celtic communities lit bonfires to ward off the AORC, RSC, is Halloween's ultimate triumph. Transforming existential terror into a holiday that children celebrate with candy and adults observe with willing participation in commercialized fear. We conquered death by making it into decoration. We defeated chaos by scheduling it on a calendar. We survived the darkness by learning to enjoy it. Halloween won by losing everything except the themes that matter. Death is real, darkness persists, and once a year, we acknowledge both before returning to the comfortable illusion that we're in control. We're not. We never were. But for one night, we get to pretend the monsters are just actors. The danger is just theater, and the terror ends when the porch lights go off. Until next October, when the veil thins again, and we do it all over. So that's the story of Halloween the 3000 year. Journey from ritual sacrifice in Irish bogs to inflatable lawn decorations you'd buy at Home Depot for $49.99. If you made it this far, thanks for sticking with me through Celtic terror, medieval corpse art, Depression-era, property destruction, and the rise of a multi-billion-dollar fear industry. I hope you learned something that'll make you sound smart at parties, or at least give you a different perspective next time you carve a pumpkin representing a man damned by both heaven and hell. Halloween is a cultural anomaly. The one-night society explicitly grants permission to openly contemplate and celebrate chaos, death, and the supernatural. Most holidays are about affirming life, community, gratitude, or religious devotion. Halloween is about acknowledging that all of that ends, that darkness exists, that death comes for everyone, and before it does, maybe we should light some candles and make some noise about it. The history we've traced isn't linear. It's cyclical, marked by repeated strategic interventions, from druidic ritual to papal decree to city, ordinance to corporate marketing campaign, or designed to manage or channel humanity's persistent anxiety regarding mortality. Think about the pattern. Celtic communities faced the existential terror of winter and supernatural chaos. So they developed Samhain bonfires, offerings, costumes, and possibly human sacrifice to restore cosmic balance. The Roman Empire absorbed those practices, blending them with their own death-honoring festivals. Christianity overlaid theological structure, replacing chaotic otherworld with orderly heaven, hell, and purgatory. Medieval culture amplified death imagery to terrifying extremes, using morbid art as spiritual motivation. Poor communities transformed theological fear into economic survival through souling. Irish immigrants brought fragmented traditions to America, where they merged, evolved, and nearly died from their own success at chaos. Then came the intervention. Des Moines and other cities faced a choice: eliminate Halloween or domesticate it. They chose domestication behavior modification through adult supervision, performance requirements, candy substitution, and patriotic propaganda. The modern trick-or-treat system emerged not from tradition but from deliberate social engineering designed to save the holiday by making it safe, controllable, and profitable. And it worked. Halloween survived the 1930s crisis by becoming everything it hadn't been before: supervised, commercial, family-friendly, cute. The terror was drained out, replaced with consumer transactions and manufactured scares. But humanity's need for terror didn't disappear. It just found new outlets. The haunted house industry emerged, transforming medieval death obsession into purchasable experience. The slasher film boom created new monsters, human rather than supernatural, but no less symbolic of deep anxieties. Halloween costumes shifted from spiritual protection to cultural expression to embodiment of media-driven fear. Each transformation stripped away another layer of genuine terror while maintaining the form. The rituals persisted even as their meanings drained away and were replaced with commercial purpose. What we're left with is the most successful death cult in human history, one that survived by completely inverting its original function. Samhain was about surviving death. Modern Halloween is about consuming death as entertainment. Same imagery: skeletons, corpses, darkness, supernatural threat, completely opposite relationship to that imagery. The Celts carved turnips to ward off stingy Jack and other damned spirits. We carve pumpkins because it's tradition, without knowing whose damnation we're representing. The Celts wore costumes as spiritual camouflage against child-stealing fairies. We dress our children as those monsters because they're cute or cool. Medieval Christians contemplated death constantly to ensure salvation. We binge-watch slasher films to feel the thrill of mortality without the inconvenience of actually dying. The most gruesome elements of Halloween's history: the ritual murder of kings preserved in bog bodies, the terrifying spectacle of the Dongs Macabre, reminding nobles and peasants that death claims everyone, the violence of 1930s delinquency that nearly destroyed the holiday hour, were mechanisms of social or cosmic control. They served functions: restore balance, ensure salvation, or release economic frustration. Modern Halloween serves different functions. It generates revenue, it provides community bonding, it offers outlet for creative expression. It allows safe transgression of normal rules. It gives children agency through door-to-door interaction. It lets adults revisit childhood. It creates shared cultural experience. These aren't small functions. They matter. But they're not existential. Nobody's survival depends on Halloween anymore. Nobody's salvation hangs on participating correctly. The stakes have dropped from infinite to essentially zero. And yet we still do it. Billions of dollars annually. Millions of participants globally. Elaborate preparations, careful costume selection, decorated houses, purchased candy, visited attractions. We invest enormous resources into a holiday that no longer serves its original purpose. Why? Because Halloween taps into something deeper than conscious belief. It accesses the accumulated cultural memory of 3,000 years of death confrontation. It provides outlet for anxieties we can't fully articulate or rationalize away. It offers permission just one night to acknowledge that life is temporary, darkness is real, and mortality awaits. We don't believe the Aosu will steal our children. We don't fear eternal torment in purgatory. We don't expect supernatural chaos when the veil thins. But we feel something on October 31st, an echo, a shadow, a vestigial recognition that this night is different, that boundaries blur, that we're connected to something ancient and ongoing. Halloween endures because, whether through ritual fire, morbid medieval art, civic behavior modification, or high-tech gore, it allows humanity to acknowledge the darkness of the dark half of the year without succumbing to it. It provides structure for chaos, form for fear, commercial packaging for existential dread. The modern enjoyment of mass-produced, gory horror is merely a safe, distant echo of Iron Age fear of malicious, death-wielding entities. The modern practice of trick-or-treating is revealed as a civic innovation, a behavior modification program that saved the holiday by substituting monetary demands and property damage with a cheap, controlled commodity. The haunted house industry represents the ultimate transformation. Terror that once required blood sacrifice now requires a credit card and 45 minutes of your Saturday night. Your challenge to look beyond the candy bag and remember the kings sacrificed in barks, their bodies preserved for millennia as testimony to cosmic accountability. Remember the rotting cadavers dancing in medieval frescoes, reminding nobles that wealth and power mean nothing to death. Remember the desperate, carved TURNIPS' grotesque faces illuminated by coal from hell's fires, warding off the eternally damned. Remember the Des Moines teenagers in 1938, smashing bird baths and setting fires until civic authorities figured out that candy was cheaper than property damage. This is the true, terrifying legacy of the holiday we celebrate. Not the Disney version, not the sanitized commercial spectacle. The actual history, brutal, pragmatic, terrifying, and ultimately successful because it adapted rather than disappeared. Halloween is 3,000 years of humanity trying to manage the one certainty we all face. Death comes. The methods changed with every era, but the need persisted. We light candles against darkness. We wear masks to hide or reveal. We knock on doors seeking connection. We tell stories about the dead. We make the terrifying into the temporary. And every November 1st, we wake up alive, having survived another year's encounter with mortality made manifest. The candy is consumed. The costumes are packed away. The decorations come down. Normal life resumes. Until next October, when the veil thins again, and we remember that underneath the capitalism and the commercialization and the cute costumes, Halloween is still doing what it's always done, giving us permission to look directly at death, acknowledge it, and then crucialize, and then continue living. That's Halloween's ultimate gift. Not the candy, not the costumes. The reminder that we can confront our deepest fears, engage with mortality directly, and survive the encounter. The Celts survived through ritual, medieval Christians through prayer, modern Americans through consumption. We're all just lighting candles against the same darkness. Sleep well. There are more stories to come.